I arrived at the cabin just before the sun started dropping behind the tall pines. The gravel road leading there was rough and narrow, the kind that made every bump rattle through the car, and the forest on both sides looked darker the further I went. The trees leaned in over the road, their branches stretching out like they were trying to cover the sky. I could smell the pine through the open crack in the window, mixed with the faint odor of dirt and old leaves. It had rained the night before, and every turn of the tires made a soft crunch over damp gravel. The cabin sat back off the road in a small clearing, old wood siding faded to gray, roof dark with moss. The place had probably been built decades ago, maybe for hunting or as a summer retreat, but it looked like no one had lived in it for years. The steps sagged a little at the front porch, and the screen door hung loosely. The windows were clouded with dust. I parked beside it, cut the engine, and for a moment the silence pressed down so heavy that it made my ears ring. No cars, no voices, no hum of faraway traffic. Just woods, stretching for miles. I got out and the air was cooler than I expected, sharp in my lungs. I stood there for a while with my bag slung over my shoulder, just listening. The trees creaked, branches shifted, and here and there a bird called, but mostly it was quiet. I had planned to stay a couple of nights, just to get away from everything, but standing there I already felt uneasy. Something about how isolated it was. Something about how the windows stared blankly at me. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and dust. The air was still heavy, like it had been closed up for too long. A small wood stove sat against the wall, and the furniture was simple. An old sofa with worn cushions, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. I set my bag down and opened the nearest window to get some air moving, but all it let in was the smell of wet pine and soil. I unpacked slowly, more to give myself something to do than because I needed much. A flashlight, a change of clothes, a knife, some food I had packed, and a blanket. I stacked the food on the counter, tested the flashlight, checked my phone. No service, not even 1 bar. I expected it, but seeing the blank signal made the silence heavier somehow. By the time the sun started slipping lower, I had lit a small fire in the stove. The wood crackled and popped, sending faint warmth across the room. Shadows stretched long across the floor, and outside the clearing turned darker until the trees were nothing but black lines against the sky. I sat on the sofa, listening to the fire and the ticking sound of the stove heating. The place felt too quiet. Every small noise seemed louder than it should have. When night fully fell, the woods outside disappeared into a single wall of black. No streetlights, no houses nearby, not even the glow of a distant town. Just total darkness pressing against the glass. I turned on my flashlight for comfort, even though the fire was enough to see by. I checked the door twice, making sure it was locked, and slid the bolt across. That was when I first heard it. A noise outside, faint but sharp against the silence. A snap like a branch breaking. I froze where I stood, listening hard. For a long stretch, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of wind through the needles. Then another sound, slower, deliberate, like weight pressing down on leaves. My throat felt dry. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk, maybe even just a raccoon moving around. The woods were full of animals. Still, the sound made my stomach tighten. I turned off the flashlight so the cabin looked dark from outside and sat back down, waiting. The noises came again, closer this time. A slow crunch of footsteps in the brush. They weren't quick, like an animal scurrying. They were measured, heavy, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I sat perfectly still, ears straining. My own breathing sounded too loud. The steps came around the side of the cabin, faint but distinct, circling slowly. I looked at the window, dark glass staring back at me. I couldn't see out, but I felt sure something was out there, watching in. I stayed frozen for minutes that felt longer than they should. Then silence again. Nothing but the faint ticking of the stove. I wanted to believe whatever it was had gone, but my body stayed tense. I got up and checked the door again, sliding the bolt tighter even though it was already firm. My hand shook a little when I turned away. I sat on the sofa for a long time, staring at the floor, listening. Eventually the fire died lower, and I added more wood, the snap and crackle almost comforting. I decided to try and sleep, even though every part of me resisted the idea of closing my eyes. I lay down on the bed, pulling the blanket over me, the flashlight clutched in my hand. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the cabin. My eyelids grew heavy, but each time I felt myself drifting, I thought I heard something again. A soft shift of leaves, faint scrape. I don't think I ever fell into a deep sleep, just a thin, restless half-dream where I was both awake and not. At some point in the night, I opened my eyes to pure blackness. The fire had burned down. The air was cold. My ears caught something faint, just outside the wall near the bed. A soft brushing sound, almost like fingers dragging along the wood siding. My heart thudded so hard it hurt. I turned the flashlight on and shined it at the window, but all it lit up was the dirty glass. The noise stopped. I lay there, flashlight pointed at the window, breath shallow, until my hand ached from gripping it. Then I heard the crunch of leaves again, moving away this time, slow, steady, like footsteps fading into the distance. I stayed awake until the first faint gray of dawn came through the window. The woods looked calm again, dew clinging to the grass in the clearing, mist low to the ground. I felt like I had been holding my breath all night. I walked outside when the sun was high enough, checking around the cabin. At first, I saw nothing but damp leaves and pine needles. Then, near the back corner, I saw them. Footprints, clear, pressed deep into the wet soil. Not animal prints. Shoes. The size looked average, maybe a man's. The prints circled the cabin once, then led off into the trees. My chest felt tight as I crouched there, staring at them. They were fresh. The edges hadn't blurred yet. I stayed only one more night, and even then I barely slept. Every sound made me tense. Every snap of a branch outside felt like someone coming back. In the morning, I packed everything quickly and left, driving back down the gravel road, checking the rearview mirror more than I needed to. When I got back to town, the noise of cars and people felt overwhelming, but safe. I kept thinking about the footprints, how deliberate they were, how whoever it was must have stood outside for a long time just listening. I never found out who it was or why they were there, but I know one thing for certain. Someone was watching that cabin while I was inside, and they were close enough to touch the walls. That's the last time I'll ever stay in a cabin alone. I had been planning that trip for weeks. I wanted time away from people, time away from the constant noise of the city, and I thought a few days in a quiet cabin would help me clear my head. A friend had told me about a small place he had once rented in the woods near a lake. It was cheap, off the grid, and far enough from the nearest town that no one would bother me. That was all I needed. I arrived in the late afternoon, after a long drive on winding roads that seemed to grow narrower the deeper I went. The sun was still up but already sinking behind the tall trees, and the shadows were long across the gravel road. The cabin sat on a little rise, looking down at the water through a thin line of trees. It wasn't much, just a single story with a front porch and 2 windows facing the lake. There was no one else around. No other houses in sight, no sound of traffic, no voices. Only the rustling of the trees and the steady hum of insects. Inside, it was plain. 1 small kitchen, a single bedroom, a bathroom with a weak water pump, and a main living space with a wood stove. There was no cell service, no television, not even a radio. That was fine. I had brought books, some food, and a notebook. My plan was to relax, cook simple meals, and spend time by the water. That first night passed quietly. I cooked pasta, sat on the porch as the sun went down, and listened to the frogs calling from the marshy parts of the lake. When it grew cold, I went inside, lit a fire in the stove, and lay in bed listening to the crackle of the wood until I fell asleep. The second day was uneventful too. I hiked along a rough trail behind the cabin, carried water from the lake, and spent hours sitting with my feet in the cold water. The cabin felt like a safe place, a little world of its own cut off from everything else. But the third night was different. I had been reading until late, the kind of reading where you lose track of time. When I finally closed the book and checked the clock on the wall, It was nearly midnight. I put another piece of wood in the stove, brushed my teeth with the pump water, and lay down. Sleep came slow. I kept hearing sounds from outside, faint at first, like branches snapping or footsteps moving through leaves. At first I thought it was animals. The woods were full of deer and raccoons. But the longer I lay there, the more it sounded like something heavier, slower, moving with purpose. I told myself I was imagining things. But then came a new sound, different from the rest. A sharp creak of wood, like one of the steps on the porch. I knew that sound because I had stepped on the same loose board earlier in the day. I held my breath. For several minutes, nothing followed. Just silence and the distant call of an owl. I tried to steady my thoughts. Maybe it was an animal after all. Maybe a raccoon had climbed onto the porch. Still, the feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the thought of someone standing outside the cabin, only a few feet from where I lay. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to sleep. When I woke in the morning, the world outside looked normal. The lake was calm, the trees bright in the sunlight. I walked around the cabin to reassure myself. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. But then I saw it. Muddy marks on the porch steps. They weren't boot prints exactly, more like smudges, but they were too large and too flat to be from an animal. They looked like the bottom of worn shoes. I stared at them for a long time. They were fresh enough that the edges were still wet. Someone had been there in the night. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was a hiker passing through. Maybe someone had come up to check the place, thinking it was empty. That could happen. But the more I thought about it, the less I believed it. The cabin was too far off the main road. No one would just wander up here by accident. I told myself I wouldn't let it ruin the trip. I spent the day as I had planned, fishing, walking the trails, trying to enjoy the quiet. But I couldn't relax fully. Every sound in the woods put me on edge. Every time I looked up from the water, I half expected to see someone standing at the tree line, watching. That night, I made sure to lock the door, even though the lock was just a simple latch. I closed the curtains, stoked the fire, and lay in bed trying to stay awake. Hours went by with nothing but the sound of the woods. I almost managed to convince myself the prints had been a trick of the mud. Then came the sound again, a creak on the porch. I froze, my ears strained for the next sound. It came slowly, one after another, the boards groaning under weight. Whoever it was, they were moving carefully, as if trying not to be heard. I stared at the dark ceiling, afraid to even breathe. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it might give me away. The steps stopped right outside the door. I waited for a knock, for the handle to turn, for something. Nothing happened, just silence. Minutes passed. Then I heard a soft scrape, like fingers or a tool against the wood near the latch. I realized they were trying to open the door quietly. Panic surged through me. I sat up, grabbed the heavy flashlight from the nightstand, and pointed it toward the door, though the curtains blocked most of the glow. I didn't dare make a sound. The latch rattled once, gently, then stopped. Whoever it was must have realized it was locked. For a long time, there was silence again. Then, just as slowly as before, the steps retreated across the porch. I listened as they faded into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the chair with the flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, waiting for them to return. They didn't. In the morning, I went outside carefully. The prints were clearer this time, plain shoe marks pressed into the damp earth around the porch. They led down the slope and disappeared into the trees. That was the moment I decided to leave. The trip was supposed to last a few more days, but it wasn't worth it. I started packing my bag, stuffing clothes and food into it as quickly as I could. I loaded everything into the car and got ready to drive. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try. I popped the hood, thinking maybe a cable had come loose. Instead, I found the wires had been cut. Clean, sharp cuts. Someone had done it during the night. My stomach dropped. I was trapped there. I considered walking back down the gravel road toward town. But it was miles of twisting forest road with no houses along the way. If the person came back while I was gone, all my supplies and belongings would be left in the cabin. Worse, if they were watching, I might not make it far before they followed me. I decided to stay put until morning. It felt safer to have four walls around me than to be walking alone through the woods at night. That entire day dragged on. I kept checking the tree line, jumping at every sound. I found myself rehearsing what I would do if they came back. I moved a chair under the door handle, kept the knife within reach, and stacked wood against the back door to make noise if anyone tried to force it. When night came, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the dark with the flashlight off, hoping it would make me harder to spot from outside. Hours passed. My eyes strained against the blackness. And then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The faint crunch of footsteps in the leaves. They circled the cabin this time, slow and deliberate, as if inspecting every wall. Then came the tap on the window, soft but unmistakable. A fingertip against the glass. I felt my chest tighten. Another tap, then a dragging sound along the wall, moving toward the door. I gripped the flashlight, ready to blind them if they came in. The steps stopped right at the front again. For what felt like an hour, there was no sound. I didn't dare move. Finally, the boards creaked as they left. But instead of fading away, the steps circled back around the cabin. I followed the sound with my ears until I realized they had gone to the back. Then came the noise of shifting wood. They were testing the back door. The pile I had stacked scraped loudly as it moved. The sound froze me in place. My knife felt useless in my hand. The noise stopped suddenly. Then, nothing. I sat there in silence, barely breathing, until the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. When I finally looked, the wood at the back door was shoved aside. The marks in the dirt showed someone had crouched there for a long time, waiting. That was it for me. I wasn't going to spend another night in that cabin. I packed water, some food, and the knife into a backpack. I left the car behind and started walking down the gravel road as soon as the sun was fully up. The walk felt endless. Every few minutes, I turned to check behind me. The woods were too quiet, the road too empty. I half expected to hear footsteps following. My nerves were stretched so thin I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sound of a bird taking off. After several hours, I finally reached the main road. A truck came by and I waved it down. The driver looked surprised to see me, but he stopped. He gave me a ride into town, where I went straight to the police. I told them everything, the footsteps, the prints, the cut wires, the attempts at the doors and windows. They listened carefully, though I could see doubt in their faces. When they drove me back to the cabin to check, I drove up into the mountains later than I planned, the old road twisting through thick pine trees that grew taller and darker the higher I climbed. The sun had dropped behind the ridges, and the last orange glow was vanishing fast, leaving long shadows across the narrow dirt road. My tires bumped over rocks and loose gravel, and I kept one hand tight on the steering wheel while the other rested on the gear stick, ready to downshift if the incline grew too steep. The cabin I rented was supposed to be small but decent enough, tucked somewhere in a clearing close to the timberline. It had no cell service, no neighbors nearby, and only one thin road leading to it. That was the reason I had chosen it. I wanted quiet, no distractions, and no contact with anyone for a few days. The air thinned as I climbed higher. I rolled the window down a little, and the cold mountain air rushed in, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. My headlights swept across tree trunks and underbrush, catching glimpses of fallen branches and boulders on the roadside. I kept checking the map I had printed out earlier because the GPS on my phone stopped working as soon as I left the last town. The last stretch of road wasn't even on the digital map, just an unmarked line on a Forest Service chart I had found online. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, it was almost fully dark. I slowed to a crawl and followed a narrower track that cut through thicker woods. My headlights barely reached ahead, and the shadows seemed to crowd closer against the car. After about a mile, the trees broke apart, and the clearing opened up. The cabin stood at the far end, its shape outlined against the darkening sky. It was smaller than I expected. A single-story wooden structure with a pitched roof, a small front porch, and a narrow chimney on one side. The wood siding looked aged, dark in some places, as if it had absorbed years of rain and snow. No lights glowed inside. It looked like it had been sitting there for a long time without anyone touching it. I parked near the front and killed the engine. The sudden silence pressed against my ears. No cars, no voices, no hum of power lines. Just the faint rustle of the wind moving through the treetops and the distant call of some birds settling in for the night. I grabbed my bag, walked up the short steps of the porch, and unlocked the front door with the key the rental company had mailed me. The lock turned stiff, like it hadn't been used in months. Inside, the air was cold and stale. My flashlight beam swept across the small main room. There was a wood stove in the corner, a small couch, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A short hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom. The kitchen area was little more than a counter, a sink, and a propane-powered stove. Everything looked worn but functional. Dust lay on the windowsills and in the corners, but the furniture was intact. I dropped my bag on the couch, turned on a small lantern I had brought, and went to check the bedroom. The bed was a simple frame with a thin mattress, covered in old sheets that smelled faintly of mildew. A dresser stood against the wall, its top scratched and dented. The bathroom had cold water, at least, though the pipes groaned when I tested the tap. There was no electricity, just a couple of old oil lamps and the wood stove for heat. I spent the first half hour gathering some firewood from the small stack near the porch and getting a fire started in the stove. The flames finally caught, and the cabin warmed slowly. I sat on the couch, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint whistling of wind through the trees outside. I ate a quick meal from the food I had packed and decided to settle in for the night. The first odd thing happened when I was getting ready for bed. I stepped outside to put some trash in the car, and I noticed the ground around the cabin was disturbed. At first I thought it was just deer tracks, but the shapes weren't right. They weren't hoof prints. They looked more like the flattened marks of boots, pressed into the soft earth and pine needles. Several of them, leading toward the trees and then circling back toward the cabin. I crouched and looked closer. The prints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Maybe a few days at most. I tried to brush it off. Maybe some hunters had come through. Maybe the cleaning crew who checked the cabin last had walked around. Still, the thought of strangers wandering around here unsettled me, especially with no neighbors close by. I went back inside, bolted the door, and told myself it didn't matter. That night I slept lightly. The silence outside was not the peaceful kind, but the heavy kind. The kind that makes every small sound stand out. I kept waking to the creaks of the wooden walls, the faint rustle of wind, the occasional crack of a branch in the forest. At one point, deep in the night, I thought I heard something brush against the cabin wall, a faint dragging sound like a hand or a branch. I lay stiff in the bed, listening hard, my breath held. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just a tree limb shifting in the wind. Eventually, I fell back asleep. In the morning, light came slowly through the windows. I made coffee on the propane stove and ate a little breakfast while standing by the front window. When I stepped outside to get more firewood, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. In the dirt just off the porch, fresh footprints had appeared. Clear, sharp, unmistakable boot prints. They led toward the side of the cabin and disappeared around the corner. I froze, staring at them. The prints were not mine. The tread was different, wider, heavier, and they hadn't been there the night before when I first looked at the ground. I walked slowly around the cabin, my eyes sweeping the ground. The prints circled partway around, then stopped near one of the back windows. From there, they turned back into the woods, fading among the pine needles. I stood there a long time trying to steady myself. Someone had been here, not days ago, not weeks ago, sometime during the night, while I slept inside. The rest of the day I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every sound outside set me on edge. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. I busied myself with chopping some extra wood, organizing my supplies, trying to keep my mind occupied. But the feeling of being watched never left. When evening came, I lit the oil lamp and sat close to the stove, listening. I didn't go outside once it was dark. The silence pressed harder against the walls, and I felt like something waited just beyond the edge of the clearing. At some point in the night, there was a noise again, a faint scrape along the wood siding. Then a dull thump, like weight pressed against the wall. My chest tightened, and I sat up in bed, staring into the darkness of the room. The sound lasted only a few seconds before stopping. The next morning, I checked again. More footprints. This time they were closer, pressed right against the porch steps. Whoever it was had come up onto the porch and then turned away again. That was when I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I drove out to the mountains with the idea that a few quiet days away from everything would do me good. I had been working long weeks in the city, surrounded by noise and people everywhere, and I thought being alone in a small cabin would help me clear my head. The cabin I rented sat far down a dirt road, tucked away in a valley surrounded by thick pine trees and steep hillsides. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and even that was a small town with only a gas station, one diner, and a grocery store. When I pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how still it was. No traffic, no people, no hum of anything man-made. Just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees and the faint creak of wood when I stepped on the porch. The cabin itself was small, just one main room with a little kitchen area, a table, and a wood stove. In the back was a bedroom with a simple bed and a small window that looked out at the woods. There was no cell service, no television, no internet. I had prepared for that, bringing books, food supplies, a lantern, and my camping gear just in case. The first day felt peaceful. I unpacked my bags, stacked the groceries in the small fridge that ran off propane, and walked the area around the cabin. There was a narrow path behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for about half a mile before turning back, already noticing how quiet the deeper woods became when I got further from the road. By evening, I had started a fire in the wood stove, cooked some canned soup, and sat by the small table reading. Felt good at first to be away from everything. When it got dark, it got very dark. There were no lights outside, no distant glow from a town or highway. The only light was the lantern inside and the stars above. The quiet turned from peaceful to heavy. Every small sound from outside felt sharp, like twigs snapping or the rustle of branches. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe deer moving through the brush, but still, I found myself glancing at the window more often than I expected. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The bed creaked when I turned over, and I kept hearing faint noises from outside. Not loud, not alarming, but enough to make me keep my ears open. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against the wall of the cabin, like a light scrape, but it didn't continue long. I tried to push it out of my mind and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I walked around the cabin again. That was when I saw something strange. In the dirt by the side of the cabin were footprints. Not boots like mine, not shoes, but bare feet. The prints were faint, like someone had walked there not long ago, but they were clear enough to see. I froze when I noticed them, my mind trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was mistaken, maybe they were old, maybe they were distorted animal tracks. But no, they looked like human footprints. They led from the trees toward the side of the cabin, then stopped a few feet from the wall. I walked the area again, checking if there were any other signs, but the prints just stopped there. I tried not to think too much of it. Could have been some hiker wandering through the area before I arrived, though it seemed odd that someone would walk barefoot this far out. I went about my day, hiked further down the trail behind the cabin, and tried to focus on the reason I came here, to rest and get away from stress. But the image of those prints stuck in my mind. That night, I heard more noises. This time, it sounded like faint crunches in the dirt outside, slow and spaced apart, like careful steps. I sat up in bed, listening, every muscle tight. The noise would stop, then start again. It seemed to circle around the cabin. I wanted to look out the window, but at the same time, I didn't want to. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear, but the steps sounded too controlled. After what felt like an hour, the sounds faded away. I stayed awake long after, staring at the ceiling, until finally sleep overtook me. In the morning, I checked around the cabin again. More footprints, this time fresher, clearer. They circled the cabin. Whoever it was had been walking around while I was inside. The prints led off into the woods but stopped where the ground became covered with pine needles. I stood there a long time, staring into the trees, my stomach tight. I considered leaving, packing up, and driving back to town, but I convinced myself not to overreact. Maybe it was someone camping nearby, maybe they were curious about the cabin. Still, I locked the door even during the day and kept my hatchet within reach. The third night was worse. I had just started to doze when I heard the doorknob rattle. Not loud, but enough to jolt me fully awake. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I lay still, listening. The knob turned again, then a soft push on the door. The cabin had a simple lock, just a latch from the inside. I had checked it twice before bed. Whoever was out there tried the knob a few more times. Then silence. I sat there, wide-eyed, gripping the hatchet. Hours passed before I relaxed enough to let sleep take me. The next morning, I didn't even check for footprints. I knew they would be there. I packed some of my things and considered leaving, but part of me was stubborn. I had paid for the cabin, I had planned this trip, and I told myself I could handle it. I decided to stay one more night, but I moved a heavy chair in front of the door and kept the hatchet by my side. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the door, lantern low, ears straining for any sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. Steps in the dirt, slow, circling. Then, a long silence. Then, from the window beside the bed, a soft tap. Just one. I gripped the hatchet so hard my hands hurt. Another tap, this time lighter. I didn't move. Hours stretched on. Finally, dawn came, the pale light filtering through the trees. When I stepped outside, I saw them. More footprints, this time closer to the windows. Whoever it was had been standing right outside while I was inside, just feet away. My chest felt hollow as I looked around, but the woods were still. No sign of anyone. That was the moment I decided I was done. I packed everything quickly, loaded the car, and drove down the dirt road. Every shadow between the trees felt like eyes. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop until I got to town. At the gas station, I sat in the car for a long time, just breathing, trying to calm down. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I read online that some cabins in remote areas get squatters or strangers wandering through, people living off-grid, sometimes not wanting to be found. Maybe it was one of them. Maybe it was someone passing through who saw the cabin as an easy target. I don't know. What I do know is that someone was out there those nights, circling the cabin, watching me, trying the door, standing at the window. And I know if the lock had been weaker or if I had opened the door to check, the ending could have been very different. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk, the air heavy and still, the last light of the sun slipping behind the ridge of trees. The gravel road that had led me there was narrow and rough, filled with potholes and loose stones that rattled under my tires, and I could feel the strain in my hands from gripping the steering wheel so tightly the entire drive. I had expected the cabin to sit close to the road, but instead, I found it tucked away in a low valley, hidden by thick woods and standing a good 100 yards back from where the gravel ended. The cabin itself looked smaller than I had imagined. A single story with weathered wood siding gone gray from years of sun and rain. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch tilted downward as if the ground beneath had shifted long ago. A narrow path cut through waist-high grass leading up to the front steps. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing and sat for a while, staring at the building. It looked lonely, abandoned, the kind of place you drive past without even noticing if you were not looking for it. I had chosen the cabin for its remoteness, for the quiet it promised, for the idea of being away from everything and everyone. I had told myself it would be peaceful, but as I sat there in the car, the engine ticking as it cooled, I felt no peace. Instead, there was a pressure in the air, an unnatural silence, the kind of silence that made the hairs on my arms rise because I realized I could not hear a single bird, not even the faint chirping of insects that usually fill the woods at dusk. It was as if the entire valley had gone still just to watch me. I forced myself out of the car and began carrying my bags up the narrow path. The grass brushed against my legs, damp with dew though the day had been dry, and my shoes left dark streaks through it. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. The door was old, painted once but now bare wood, with a lock that resisted before finally giving way. The smell hit me immediately when I opened it. Stale wood, dust, and the faint sourness of something that had long been closed off from fresh air. Inside, the cabin was one large room with a small kitchen at the back and a single door that led to what I assumed was the bedroom. A fireplace dominated the main wall, filled with ashes that had gone cold years ago. Dust lay thick on the mantel, the floor, the furniture. The only sound was the floorboards creaking under my steps. I set my bags down and walked through each room slowly. The bedroom held a narrow bed with a thin mattress that sagged in the middle, a dresser with one drawer missing, and a cracked mirror nailed to the wall. The bathroom was little more than a closet with a rust-stained sink, a toilet, and a shower stall that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I ran the tap out of curiosity, and after a long groan from the pipes, water sputtered out brown before slowly running clear. When I returned to the main room, the sun had dropped lower, and the cabin was filling with shadows. I turned on the light switch by the door, and to my relief, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered and glowed. The power was still working, though dim. I set up my things slowly, moving with care as though afraid to disturb the cabin too much. I laid out my sleeping bag on the bed instead of using the mattress and placed a lantern near the door in case the light gave out. By the time I finished, it was fully dark outside. The windows showed nothing but blackness. I heated a can of soup on the stove, the smell filling the room, and sat at the small table to eat. The silence pressed around me, so heavy that the sound of the spoon scraping against the bowl seemed sharp and too loud. I told myself that I would get used to it, that the first night in a strange place always felt uneasy. But as I moved through the cabin, turning off the light and lying down in the bed, I could not shake the sense that something was wrong with the silence. It was not just quiet. It was empty, hollow, as if the entire valley had been stripped of sound. My breathing and heartbeat filled my ears until they were all I could hear. That night, I woke suddenly. I do not know what time it was. The darkness was complete, the kind where you cannot see your hand in front of your face. My heart was racing, though I did not know why. The cabin was silent. But then I realized I had not woken because of silence. I had woken because of a sound. It had been faint, distant, but sharp enough to cut through my sleep. A crack, like a branch snapping under weight. I lay still, straining to hear. Nothing, just the heavy dark pressing down on me. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon moving through the brush. I closed my eyes again, though sleep did not come easily. The next morning, light filtered weakly through the dirty windows, and I got up stiff and unrest. The air inside the cabin was stale, so I stepped outside. The valley looked different in daylight. The tall grass swayed with a light breeze, and the trees at the edges stood thick and green. But even then, there was no sound of birds, no buzzing insects, just the faint rustle of grass and leaves. I explored the area around the cabin, walking the perimeter slowly. The ground was soft, and here and there I found faint impressions in the soil. Some were deer tracks, but others looked less clear, like prints worn down by time. They trailed off into the woods, too faint to follow. That day passed slowly. I tried to read, to write, to occupy myself with small tasks, but I found myself checking the windows constantly, glancing out into the clearing as though expecting to see something there. At nightfall, I locked the door and set the lantern by my bed. Again, I lay awake longer than I meant to, listening to the silence. When I finally drifted off, I woke again to a sound, this time closer, a rustling, heavy, deliberate. My pulse raced. It was not the quick, light sound of an animal. It was slow, heavy, moving with purpose. I sat up, every muscle tense. The sound stopped. The silence pressed in again. I did not move for a long time, barely breathing, listening for it to return. When it did not, I lay back down, though my eyes stayed open until the gray light of dawn finally crept through the window. The next morning, I checked the ground outside the cabin. The grass around the path looked disturbed, flattened in places, though I could not be sure if it had always been like that. I knelt down, searching the soil, and found a partial footprint pressed into the dirt just off the path. It was not deep, but it was clear enough. Too large for me, too heavy. That was when I realized I was not alone out here. I had been planning the trip for a few months. Life in the city was pressing on me in ways I didn't notice at first, but the weight grew heavier as the weeks went on. The endless traffic, the constant hum of people, and the noise that never really stopped even late at night had worn me down. I told myself I needed a break, and when I found the listing for the cabin, I knew it was what I was looking for. It was described as old but sturdy, set deep into the woods by a narrow dirt road, miles from the nearest town. The owner said it had no internet, no television, no phone line, only a wood stove, a propane lantern, and a pump well out back for water. He had mentioned there was cell service if I hiked a half-mile uphill, but otherwise I'd be cut off. At first, I liked the sound of that. I thought being completely away from people would clear my head. I thought a few days alone, without distractions, would help me breathe again. The drive out there took longer than I expected. After I left the highway, the road narrowed, then turned into gravel, then finally to dirt that my car handled poorly. Each mile deeper into the woods felt like I was driving away from the world I knew. I passed no other cars, no houses, not even a mailbox. Only trees, rows of pines mixed with thick oaks and maples that crowded the sky. I remember the moment I realized how quiet it had become. The air felt heavy without the usual background sounds of the world. I rolled down my window, and instead of city noise, I heard nothing but the occasional rustle of branches and the distant caw of a crow. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to lower. It wasn't yet evening, but the woods had a way of swallowing light early. The cabin sat back from the road, slightly tilted, with an old porch that creaked when I stepped on it. The place looked exactly as the pictures had shown. Small, weathered wood siding, one front window, and a heavy door with a rusted handle. Out back I saw the well pump and a shed that leaned so badly I wondered how it was still standing. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a cot against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and the wood stove in the corner. A shelf held a few dusty jars, matches, and a stack of firewood. The air smelled of dust and old pine. There was a small rug on the floor, frayed at the edges, and a lantern hanging from a hook on the ceiling. Everything felt still, untouched for weeks, maybe months. That first night was calm. I lit the lantern, made a small fire, and ate the food I brought with me. When the light outside faded, I realized just how dark the woods became. Without nearby houses or streetlights, the darkness outside the window was complete. It pressed against the glass like something solid. I had brought a flashlight, but even with it, stepping outside felt unnerving. The beam only cut a short cone into the blackness, and beyond that, there was nothing but the thought of endless trees and dirt. I lay in the cot that night listening to the sounds of the woods. At first, it was nothing unusual: crickets, a distant owl, the occasional snap of a branch in the wind. But as I settled deeper into the night, I noticed something strange. Every sound carried more weight here. A small crack in the woods sounded sharper, closer, almost deliberate. I told myself it was because I wasn't used to the silence, that in the city these small sounds were lost under traffic and voices. Here they stood out. Still, I found myself lying awake longer than I wanted, staring at the faint shadows the lantern threw against the wall. The next morning I woke early, my back stiff from the cot. The air was cool, and I pumped water from the well, splashing it on my face. The woods looked different in daylight, less threatening, almost peaceful. I went for a walk down the dirt road, my boots crunching on the gravel. I didn't see anyone, not even a car track fresher than my own from yesterday. It gave me an uneasy feeling, though I brushed it off. This was what I came for after all: quiet solitude. Back at the cabin, I spent the day reading a book I brought, chopping a bit of wood, and sitting on the porch. The hours passed slowly without a phone or clock to look at. The sun moved, and the woods shifted with the light. I kept catching myself staring at the tree line, though. I didn't know why. It was like my eyes kept going back to it on their own, like I expected something to be there. That second night is when things began to feel wrong. I had just put out the lantern and lay down when I heard something outside. At first, it was a soft crunch, like weight on leaves. Then another, closer. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but as I listened, the steps didn't sound like the careful movements of a deer. They were heavier, slower, with space between them like someone walking. I lay frozen, listening. The steps moved around the cabin, from one side to the other, slow and steady. I wanted to tell myself it was my imagination, but the sound was too clear. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding, and pointed it at the window. Nothing. The woods were still. I didn't dare go outside. I sat up most of the night, my eyes burning, until the sounds faded and the woods grew quiet again. In the morning, I forced myself to check. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. I half expected to see nothing, but then I noticed it. In the dirt, just a few feet from the porch, were prints. Not animal tracks, footprints. They were faint but clear enough, shoes, size not too different from mine. The tracks circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the trees. A chill ran through me. I stood staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here in the middle of the night, miles from town, walking around a cabin they didn't rent? I told myself maybe it was the owner checking in, but the thought didn't settle. Why would he circle the place and leave without saying anything? And why at night? The day dragged after that. Every sound put me on edge. When a squirrel darted across the porch, I jumped. I sat at the table, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving that rough dirt road at night kept me in place. I told myself I'd wait until morning. That third night was worse. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening. Hours passed. Then it came again, the crunch of steps in the leaves. Slow, deliberate circling. My skin crawled. This time, they stopped at the porch. The old wood creaked under weight. My chest tightened. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight. I stared at the door, waiting for it to open, but it never did. After a long stretch, the steps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep. When dawn came, I checked again. New footprints in the dirt. He had been back. This time, they led from the road, around the porch, then vanished again into the trees. By now, every instinct told me to leave, but I hesitated. The rental was paid for, my things were here, and a part of me felt like I might be overreacting. Still, I couldn't shake the fear. I packed some things into the car just in case, then sat on the porch through the afternoon, eyes fixed on the tree line. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. That night, I tried something different. I didn't put out the lantern. I sat awake, pretending to sleep, watching the door. Hours passed. Just when I thought maybe he wouldn't come, the steps began again. Slow, steady, circling. My skin prickled. I stayed still, barely breathing, the lantern casting dim light across the cabin. The steps reached the porch again, closer this time, and then stopped right outside the door. The silence was worse than the sound. I waited, every muscle tense, sure the handle would turn. It never did. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away, fading into the trees once more. In the morning, I didn't wait. I packed everything quickly, threw it into the car, and started driving. My hands shook on the wheel. I didn't look back at the cabin. The dirt road seemed longer on the way out, every turn dragging, every shadow in the trees making me flinch. When I finally reached the paved road, relief washed over me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station miles away. Only then did I step out, stretch my legs, and breathe. My body felt drained, like I had been holding my breath for days. I never told the owner what happened. I never asked about the footprints or the nights of pacing outside. Maybe it was better not to know. All I knew was that someone had been there. Not an animal, not my imagination. Someone. They never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves. They only circled, watched, and left. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. But I know this. When you are alone in the woods, far from anyone, and you hear footsteps at night that are not your own, you understand how vulnerable you really are. I thought I wanted solitude. What I found was something else entirely. The quiet truth that out there, in the dark, you're never as alone as you think. And I never went back to that cabin again. I never liked the feeling of being alone in places that were too quiet, but I had convinced myself that a weekend at the old cabin would do me good. Life had been too loud and busy, and I thought that cutting myself off from everything for a few days would help clear my head. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that I lost phone reception about 20 minutes before reaching it. The drive was rough, the road little more than dirt and gravel, and every mile I went further into the trees, the more I felt the outside world disappearing behind me. The cabin had been in my family for years, though nobody really used it much anymore. I had only been there twice before, both times when I was younger, and even then I remembered the silence of the place more than anything else. Now that I was older, I thought I could handle it better. I told myself I'd use the time to relax, maybe do some writing, cook simple meals, and sleep without alarms or noise. That was the idea. When I pulled up, the cabin looked older than I remembered. The wood siding had gone gray, and some of the steps leading up to the porch sagged under my weight. The windows were dusty, and inside it smelled like closed-up air and old pine. Still, it had everything I needed. A small wood stove, a couple of chairs, a table, a narrow bed in the back room, and shelves with old canned food and tools. I dropped my bag on the table, opened the shutters to let light in, and tried to get comfortable. First, it felt good. I made a small fire in the stove, unpacked my bag, and stepped outside to breathe in the cool air. The trees were tall and crowded together, blocking most of the sky. The only sound was wind moving through the branches. It was quiet in a way I wasn't used to, the kind of quiet where you notice your own heartbeat and the sound of your shoes against dirt. The first night, I settled in easily. I cooked some pasta on a small gas burner I had brought with me, wrote in a notebook for a while, and then lay in bed listening to the stove crackle. The silence pressed in, but I told myself I'd get used to it. I locked the front door even though I knew no one should be out there. It was just habit. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. The fire had burned down and the cabin was cold. I could hear the wind outside, stronger than before, making the walls creak. I lay there for a long time, trying to fall back asleep, when I thought I heard something else under the sound of the wind. It was faint, like a footstep on the porch, or maybe just a branch shifting against the wood. I held my breath, listening. After a while it stopped, or blended into the wind, and I told myself it was nothing. I went back to sleep eventually, though it took a long time. The next morning I shook it off. I made coffee on the burner, ate some bread I had brought, and then took a short walk through the woods. The ground was soft with pine needles, and every step felt muffled. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how tangled the woods were, with fallen trees, thorn bushes, and animal paths cutting across the ground. I tried to follow one of the paths for a while, but gave up when it disappeared into a thicket. By the time I got back to the cabin, my legs were scratched and my shoes damp. That afternoon, I stacked some firewood I found under the porch, read an old paperback I had brought, and tried not to think about the night before. But when evening came again, I felt the same unease creeping back. The woods darkened fast, the trees blocking out the last light, and soon the cabin was lit only by the stove and a lantern. I kept the lantern close as I ate dinner, my eyes flicking to the window every so often. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone could be standing just beyond the glass, hidden by the dark. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing faint noises outside, little creaks and shifts that didn't sound like the wind. Around midnight, there was a sharp sound on the porch, like something scraping against the wood. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and listened. Came again, a dragging sound, then silence. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark ceiling until the stove went cold. When morning came, I forced myself to check the porch. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just leaves scattered across the boards. But then I noticed a long mark on the step, like something heavy had been dragged across it. I crouched down and touched it, The wood was splintered fresh. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer brushing against the steps, or a raccoon climbing around. But the mark looked deliberate, too straight. I didn't go for a walk that day. I stayed near the cabin, cutting small logs and keeping the fire going. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. Every time I went outside, I felt eyes on me from the trees. Once, when I was chopping wood, I heard a sharp crack of a branch breaking deeper in the woods. I turned fast, staring into the trees, but saw nothing. That night was worse. I barely slept. The noises started again, soft at first, then louder. Something brushed against the wall of the cabin. Then a dull thud, as if something had leaned against it. I sat up in bed, knife in hand, waiting. Hours seemed to crawl by. Then came the sound of slow steps on the porch. One step, then another. The boards creaked under the weight. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tight my hand ached. The steps stopped near the door. For a long time there was nothing, just silence so deep I thought I had imagined it. Then came a soft tap against the door, like a fingertip testing it. I stayed completely still. My mind raced with thoughts. What if the lock didn't hold? What if it was some hunter or drifter? What if they were waiting for me to move? Eventually, the noise stopped. I don't know how long it took, but the steps faded, and the night went quiet again. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. Something was out there, and I didn't want to find out what. I packed my bag fast, stuffed everything inside without care, and got ready to leave. But when I stepped outside, I froze. In the dirt just beyond the porch were tracks. Not animal tracks, boots. They circled the cabin and led off into the trees. My chest tightened. Someone had been out there all night, walking around the cabin, watching. The scrape on the step, the taps, the noises. It hadn't been in my head. It was real. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin out of reflex, and headed for the car. My eyes kept darting to the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. The woods felt too still, too heavy with silence. When I reached the car, my hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before getting the door open. The engine started, and I pulled away fast, tires spitting gravel. I didn't look back. The drive out felt longer than it should have, every bend in the road making me tense, thinking someone might step out or a car might block the way. But no one came. By the time I reached town, I felt a mix of relief and sickness. Relief to see people, cars, lights. Sickness at the thought of what might have happened if I had stayed one more night. I kept thinking about the tracks in the dirt, the slow steps on the porch, the soft tap on the door. Whoever it was, they had been testing me, watching me, waiting. I never went back to the cabin. A few months later, I told my family I thought it should be sold. I didn't explain why. The cabin was still there, standing in the woods, empty now. But sometimes I think about it late at night, and I wonder if whoever was out there that night still goes back, circling the cabin, waiting for someone else to come. That weekend changed how I see silence. It isn't peaceful anymore. Silence means listening. Silence means someone could be there, just out of sight, waiting. I had been looking forward to that trip for months. Life in the city had been draining me in ways I didn't notice until it was too late. The constant noise, the late nights, the cramped apartment, the way every single day felt the same. I reached a point where I couldn't even tell weekdays from weekends anymore. That was when I decided to get away for a while. I wanted something quiet, something raw, something that reminded me of what it felt like to live without having everything so close and so easy. I found a listing for a cabin online. It wasn't part of a resort or anything organized like that. It was just a small wooden cabin in the middle of thick forest, offered by a man who rarely rented it out. The pictures showed dark pine trees, a gravel path leading up to the cabin, and a little porch with 2 old chairs. Inside, it looked simple but good enough. A bed, a stove, a table, and a wood-burning fireplace. No television, no internet, not even cell service. That was the point. I didn't want any distractions. When I arrived, the drive alone told me how far I was getting from normal life. The paved road turned into cracked asphalt, then into dirt, then into a single-lane track that twisted between endless trees. I didn't see another car. I barely saw signs of people at all. At one point, a deer ran across the track in front of me, and I had to slam the brakes. My tires skidded on loose gravel, and my chest jumped. But after that, it was just quiet again. Just the hum of my car and the endless rows of trees. The cabin itself sat at the end of that track. I parked on a patch of dirt beside it. It looked older than the pictures had made it seem. The wood was weathered gray, the porch steps leaned a little, and the tin roof had dark streaks running down. But it was standing, and when I went inside, everything was as promised. The table was scratched, the bed was plain, but it was solid. There was a stove with propane, a few pans, and shelves with old jars of dried beans and rice. I dropped my bag on the bed and felt a kind of relief I hadn't felt in a long time. I was away, finally away. The first night was simple. I cooked a little food, ate while sitting on the porch, and listened to the wind move through the pines. The forest around me was deep. The trees were packed close, their trunks tall and dark, with branches so thick they blocked out most of the fading light. Even during the day, it felt dim around the cabin. At night, it became something else. By the time I went to bed, the silence was almost heavy. The only sound was the creaking of the cabin walls as the air cooled. I slept lighter than I thought I would, waking up several times to adjust to the silence. The next day, I decided to walk around the area. The owner had left a hand-drawn map on the table. It showed a rough outline of trails leading through the forest, a stream not far away, and an old fire road that connected back to the main highway about 6 miles off. I put a bottle of water in my pocket and walked. The forest felt bigger when I was actually inside it. The trees blocked the sun, and the ground was covered in layers of old needles that softened my steps. It was so quiet that the sound of a twig snapping under my boot felt loud. I followed a trail until it split, then followed it again until I realized I wasn't keeping track of where I was going. That was when I turned back. The rest of the day passed without anything strange. I cooked again, read a little, and went to bed. But that second night was when the feeling started. I woke up at some point after midnight. I didn't know why at first. The cabin was still. My heart was beating a little too fast, like I had already been startled by something. I lay still on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, and then I heard it. A sound outside. Not close, but not far either. It was steady like steps. Not an animal moving quickly, but something heavier. The sound of weight pressing into the earth, slow and careful. I froze and listened. It moved between the trees, circling somewhere beyond the porch. I waited for it to fade, but it didn't. Paused, then started again, closer this time. My throat went dry. I thought about getting up, but I couldn't move. It wasn't like I thought it was something supernatural. It was worse because I knew it was real. I was in the middle of nowhere, and someone or something large was moving outside my cabin. After what felt like forever, the sound drifted away into the trees. I kept listening, every muscle tense. But eventually, silence returned. I don't know how long I lay there awake, but the next time I opened my eyes, sunlight was coming through the window. In the morning, I tried to push it aside. Maybe it was a deer, maybe an elk, maybe even a bear. I didn't know what kinds of animals lived in that area, but I knew it was wilderness. Animals made sense. But even when I told myself that, the memory of the steps didn't feel like an animal. They had been slow, careful, like someone trying not to be noticed. I went outside to check the ground. The dirt around the cabin showed nothing clear. A few scuffs that might have been old boot prints, but nothing definite. I told myself I was overthinking, but I still kept glancing over my shoulder while I made breakfast. The third night confirmed it for me. I woke again, this time to a sharper sound. Wood creaking. My heart kicked hard, and I realized the sound wasn't outside in the trees. It was on the porch. Slow weight pressing into the boards. The old wood groaned faintly. Someone was standing just outside my door. I stayed absolutely still. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. The sound shifted, like weight moving from one foot to another. My mind raced with what I should do. Should I get up? Should I grab something as a weapon? but I didn't move. Couldn't. After a long minute, the sound of weight shifted again. Then silence. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until daylight, then I got up and checked the porch. The boards looked the same as always, weathered and gray. But I knew I had heard it. The whole next day I couldn't relax. Every time the wind moved the trees, I looked up. Every time I heard a branch snap, I flinched. I thought about packing my things and leaving, but the idea of walking that long dirt track back to the highway felt worse. It was miles of forest, and if someone was out there, I would be even more exposed on foot. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat at the table with the oil lamp burning, waiting. Hours passed. My eyes burned, my back ached, but I stayed up. And sure enough, sometime deep into the night, I heard the sound again. Not on the porch this time, out in the woods circling. Slow steps in the pine needles, pausing, starting again, moving around the cabin like whoever it was didn't want to come close yet. That was when I knew for sure it wasn't an animal. No deer or bear circled a cabin on careful feet, night after night. This was a person, and they were watching me. By the fourth night, I was worn down. My body ached from lack of sleep. My hands trembled when I lit the lamp, and I could barely eat. But my fear had sharpened into something cold and clear. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, and they were waiting for something. I didn't know if they wanted me gone, or if they wanted me to leave the cabin so they could do something worse. That night, the sound came again, closer than ever. Not just circling in the woods, not just on the porch. This time, I heard the doorknob rattle. It was slow, almost careful. A faint metallic click as it turned against the lock. My chest pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. The door held, but the sound of that knob moving was worse than anything before. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching anymore. They were trying to come in. I sat there at the table with my eyes locked on the door until morning. When the sun finally came, I couldn't stand it anymore. I packed my bag in a rush, grabbed the car keys, and didn't even bother to clean up. I walked fast to my car, my head snapping at every sound in the trees. The forest was still, but I felt eyes on me. When the engine turned over, I felt a flood of relief. I drove down that dirt track fast, faster than was safe, my tires spitting rocks. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of the main highway. When I finally made it back into cell service, I pulled over and sat in the car, shaking. My body felt weak, like I had just run miles. I thought about calling someone, the sheriff, maybe the owner of the cabin, but what would I even say? That I heard someone walking around? That the doorknob rattled at night? It would sound like paranoia, like I was spooked by the wilderness. There was no proof, but I knew what I heard. I never went back to that cabin. I never even checked the listing again. For weeks afterward, I woke at night to imagine sounds in my apartment. I would jolt awake certain that someone was standing just outside my door. It faded slowly, but even now, whenever I'm alone in a quiet place, I still remember the sound of those careful steps circling in the dark, and the faint click of a doorknob turning when I was too afraid to move. That was the clearest lesson I ever learned. Out there, away from everyone, away from help, it doesn't take much to realize how small you really are, and how dangerous it is when you're the only thing keeping yourself safe. I had been looking forward to that trip for months. The whole point was to disconnect, to get away from the noise and weight of everyday life. I wanted quiet. I wanted the kind of stillness that only came from being far away from towns, highways, and people. That was why I had booked the cabin. It wasn't the kind of cozy little place you see on postcards. It was an old hunting cabin, rough and worn, built decades ago, sitting by itself in a clearing that was barely visible from the dirt road that led to it. The nearest house was miles away. The man who rented it out told me there was no running water and only a small wood stove for heat. That was fine with me. I had supplies, food, water, a flashlight, a lantern, and plenty of batteries. I wanted simple living for a week, away from everything. The drive there had already set the tone. After leaving the highway, I drove nearly an hour down twisting dirt roads, most of which looked like they hadn't been graded in years. The trees pressed in close on both sides, thick and tall, and when I finally saw the cabin, it appeared suddenly between them, the roof dark with age and moss, the porch leaning a little to one side. It looked abandoned, even though I knew it wasn't. That first impression stuck with me, though. I parked, carried my bags inside, and settled in. The interior was just as rough as the outside. There was one main room with a table, 2 chairs, the stove, and an old cot in the corner. The wooden walls were unpainted, scarred with time and weather. The single window looked out toward the tree line. When I set my bags down, the silence wrapped around me. I could hear only the faint creaking of the boards under my weight and the occasional distant bird outside. It was exactly the isolation I thought I wanted. That first evening passed quietly. I unpacked, made myself a simple meal on the little stove, and walked around the clearing until it grew dark. I noticed how quickly the shadows thickened in those woods. The trees seemed to swallow light. By the time I went back inside and lit my lantern, I felt like the cabin was floating in a sea of blackness. When I lay down on the cot that night, every little sound reached me. The groan of the wooden frame, the wind through the cracks, the snap of branches outside. I told myself I would get used to it. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore. I had brought a map with me, though most of the smaller trails weren't marked. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and my pocket knife, then headed into the woods. The air was cool, damp from the night, and the forest floor was thick with leaves. I walked for hours, weaving through the trees, following deer paths, climbing over fallen logs. The silence in those woods was deeper than I expected. Sometimes I stopped just to listen, but heard nothing at all. No cars, no voices, not even the usual hum of insects. It was almost too quiet. At one point, I found an old fire ring made of stones, blackened with ash. It looked like no one had used it in years, but the sight of it reminded me I wasn't the first person to wander here. I moved on and kept going until the sun dipped lower, then retraced my steps back to the cabin. That night was harder. I lay awake for a long time. My mind wouldn't settle. I thought about how far away I was from anyone else, how no one even knew exactly where I was except the man who rented me the cabin. Every creak in the woods sounded sharper. At one point, I thought I heard something move outside the window, a soft crunch like a footstep. I froze, barely breathing, waiting, but nothing followed. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been a branch falling or an animal passing through. Still, I slept poorly. On the third day, I noticed something strange. I had been out walking again, this time heading in the opposite direction from the day before. I came across a tree with deep cuts in the bark, long vertical marks. At first, I thought it might have been a bear, but the cuts looked too clean, too straight, almost like they had been made with a blade. I crouched down and touched them. The wood inside was still pale and fresh. These were recent. That unsettled me. Someone had been here, someone with a knife or an axe. I stood there for a long time, staring at those marks, before finally turning back toward the cabin. From then on, I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. Every time I walked in the woods, I found myself glancing over my shoulder. Every time I heard a twig snap, I froze. That night, when I sat by the stove eating dinner, I kept looking toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing out there in the dark. The fourth day brought more evidence. I went to gather firewood near the edge of the clearing. As I bent to pick up some branches, I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. Not mine. They were larger, heavier, pressed deep into the soil. They led from the trees toward the cabin and then back again. My stomach sank when I saw them. They hadn't been there before. I stood perfectly still, staring at those prints. They were clear, not washed away or faded, which meant they were recent. Very recent. Someone had come close to the cabin, walked around, and then left. I couldn't imagine why. My hands felt cold as I carried the firewood back inside and barred the door. That night was the longest yet. I barely slept. I sat on the cot, lantern burning low, listening. Every sound made me flinch. At one point, I thought I heard breathing outside the wall. I held my knife tightly, waiting, but the sound faded. Hours passed. When dawn finally came, I felt exhausted. I thought about leaving, packing my things and driving back to the highway, but part of me resisted. I told myself maybe I was overreacting, that the prints could have been old, the marks on the tree harmless. I had come here for solitude, and maybe I was just not used to it. I tried to convince myself of that, but deep down I knew better. The 5th day confirmed it. I had left my backpack on the porch overnight. When I went outside in the morning, it was gone. I searched the clearing, then the edge of the woods, and finally found it about 50 yards into the trees. It had been opened. The food inside was gone. Nothing else was taken. That detail chilled me more than anything else. Whoever had done it didn't just stumble across my things. They had been watching. They had chosen what to take. The realization hit me hard. Someone was out there. Someone was watching me, maybe even at that very moment. I grabbed the bag and hurried back inside. My hands shook as I locked the door again. The rest of that day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus. I kept pacing the small room, listening, peering out the window. The trees seemed to hide everything. I didn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on me constantly. That night, it escalated. I had just started to drift into sleep when a sharp sound jolted me awake. A scrape against the wood. I sat up fast, heart hammering, and listened. Another scrape, closer to the door. Then silence. I gripped the knife, my whole body tense, straining to hear. Slowly, carefully, I stood and moved toward the door. The lantern light flickered against the walls. Then I heard it, footsteps retreating into the woods. Not hurried, steady, deliberate. They faded into the distance. I stayed awake until morning, every muscle rigid. When light finally filtered through the cracks, I went outside. There were new footprints in the dirt, right up against the cabin door. Whoever it was had been only inches away from me. That broke whatever courage I had left. I couldn't stay. I packed my things quickly, loading everything into the car. My hands kept shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before I finally started the engine. I backed out of the clearing, eyes flicking constantly to the trees, convinced I would see someone watching. The drive back down that dirt road felt endless. Every shadow between the trees looked like movement. Every bend made me afraid of what might be waiting around it. When I finally reached the highway, I felt like I could breathe again, though my chest was still tight. Even after I returned home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The marks on the tree, the footprints, the backpack, the sounds at night. Whoever had been out there hadn't tried to hurt me directly, but they had been close, too close. They had stood at my door in the dark, only a thin wooden wall separating us. The thought still makes my skin crawl. I had gone to that cabin for quiet and escape. What I found instead was the realization of how vulnerable isolation can make you. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, I was completely alone, and someone knew it. Someone took advantage of it. I never went back. I won't ever go back. And even now, when I'm lying in my own bed at home, safe in the city, there are nights when I wake suddenly, sure that I heard a scrape at the door, and it all comes rushing back. I came out to the cabin because I wanted a break from everything. Life in the city had been getting to me. Too much noise, too many people, and too much stress. I thought a few days out in the woods would clear my head. The cabin I rented wasn't fancy. It was old, tucked away at the end of a rough dirt road, surrounded by pines and thick brush. I picked it for that reason. I didn't want neighbors or passing cars. I wanted silence. Nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and maybe the crack of a fire in the stove at night. The first day went as I expected. I drove up the long winding road, my car bouncing over ruts and rocks, until the trees closed in and the cabin came into view. It looked small and tired, built from weathered logs, with a tin roof that caught the late sun. There was a porch that sagged on one side, and a stack of old firewood against the wall. A single window looked out from the front. Behind it stretched forest, thick and dark. Inside was even more simple. A single room with a cot, a table, and a wood stove. There was a small kitchen space with an old propane burner and a sink that only worked if you pumped the handle hard enough. The place smelled of damp wood and dust. There was a door at the back that led to a tiny bathroom with no shower, just a toilet that flushed into a tank outside. It wasn't comfortable, but it was what I wanted. That first night, I cooked a can of soup on the burner, ate it while sitting at the table, and then read by lantern light until I grew tired. I thought the silence would bother me, but it didn't. It felt thick, like a blanket. I heard the wind through the trees, a few cracks of branches as they shifted, and once or twice the far-off howl of what I guessed was a coyote. Nothing close, nothing threatening. I locked the door, crawled into the cot, and drifted off. The second day I spent outside. The cabin sat on a small clearing with grass up to my knees and weeds pushing against the porch. I walked the edge of the trees, followed a deer trail for a while until I reached a creek, then turned back. I brought my lunch outside and ate on the steps, swatting at flies and listening to the sound of the water trickling through the woods. I thought about how good it felt to be away from everything. My phone barely had service, which I liked. No one could bother me. That night, I built a fire in the stove and kept it going as I sat in the quiet. I thought about how I hadn't seen another person since I turned off the main road. Not a car, not a hiker, nothing. The only tracks I saw were deer and raccoon prints near the creek. I felt safe in that thought, wrapped in solitude. But later, after I blew out the lantern and settled into bed, I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, just a crunch of something outside. My eyes opened to the dark cabin, the faint glow of the stove casting a red shadow against the ceiling. I lay still, listening. Another crunch. This one closer, heavy, like a boot on dry leaves. My heart thumped in my chest. I told myself it could be an animal. A deer maybe, or a bear nosing around. I had food scraps in a bag outside on the porch. That was enough to draw something in. I wanted to believe that, but the more I listened, the less it sounded like an animal. The steps were slow and spaced apart. Not the nervous shuffle of a deer or the dragging pads of a bear. These sounded measured, like someone was moving carefully through the clearing. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, and then I heard it again, the soft creak of the porch step. That sound didn't lie. Something or someone was on the porch. My hands gripped the blanket tight. I stared at the door, faintly outlined by the red glow of the stove. I thought of the lock. It was old, just a simple latch that could be pried loose with enough force. The porch creaked again. I pictured someone standing there, right on the other side of the thin wall, listening like I was listening. I forced myself not to move. The sound went quiet after that. Minutes passed, then more. My chest ached from holding my breath. I waited for a knock, a rattle of the handle, something. Nothing came. After a long time, the silence returned. I told myself again it could have been an animal, maybe leaning against the railing and making it groan. Maybe I was wrong about the sound. My thoughts ran in circles until exhaustion took over and I drifted back to sleep. When I woke the next morning, the sun was already high. I stepped onto the porch to see if anything had been there. The dirt and grass were disturbed. There were prints, not hooves or paws, but the faint outline of boots pressed into the soil near the steps. They weren't fresh enough to be sharp, but they hadn't been there yesterday. My stomach tightened as I bent to look. The prints led from the trees to the porch and then back again, fading into the woods. I told myself it could have been someone hiking. Maybe they wandered too close, saw the cabin, and left. The thought didn't sit right, though. There were no trails out here, and anyone hiking this deep would have had no reason to walk up to a cabin in the night. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling stayed with me the rest of the day. I kept looking at the tree line as I chopped kindling and fetched water from the creek. I ate lunch inside instead of on the steps. I told myself I was being paranoid, but when the light began to fade, I felt dread creeping in. That night, I couldn't relax. I sat with the lantern burning longer than usual, reading the same page over and over without taking it in. I finally blew it out and lay in bed, staring at the dark. I listened to every creak of the cabin, every sigh of wind against the roof. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of steps in the clearing. Slow, deliberate. My mouth went dry. The sound of the porch followed, the same groan of wood under weight. I lay stiff, clutching the blanket, and heard the faint scrape against the door. Not a knock, not a try at the handle, just something dragging lightly across the wood. It stopped. The silence after was worse. I pictured someone standing there, ear pressed to the door, waiting for me to move. The seconds stretched into minutes. I could hear my own pulse hammering in my head. After a long time, the sound faded. The steps moved away into the brush, one by one, until they vanished. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, unable to move. In the morning, I checked again. More prints in the dirt, clearer this time. Boots, definitely. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, stopped at the porch, then retreated the way they came. Whoever it was hadn't knocked, hadn't spoken, hadn't tried to force their way in. Just came close, then left. That chilled me worse than anything. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I moved through the clearing with quick glances over my shoulder. Every shift of the trees looked like someone ducking out of sight. I considered leaving, but the thought of driving the rough dirt road back at night wasn't much better. I told myself I could last one more night, then leave in the morning. That evening, I stacked wood inside, filled water, and made sure everything I might need was at hand. I locked the door tight and pushed the table against it. It wasn't much, but it made me feel better. I kept the lantern on late again, but when I finally blew it out, the darkness felt heavier than before. I heard them sooner that night. Not long after I lay down, the crunch of steps returned. My body went rigid. This time, they didn't hesitate at the edge of the clearing. They came straight to the porch. The boards groaned, then the faint rattle of the handle. The door held, but my breath caught in my throat. The rattle stopped. Silence. Then the soft scrape again, like a hand brushing the wood. Minutes dragged. I thought about the table braced against the door, about how thin the walls were. I thought about what would happen if they really wanted to come in. The sound shifted. Steps moved along the side of the cabin. I listened as they circled, slow, steady. Gravel and dirt crunched as they passed the window. I didn't dare look. They circled the whole cabin before stopping again at the porch. Another creak of the boards, then nothing. I don't know how long I lay there. My eyes burned from not blinking. My muscles ached from staying still. At some point, the silence stretched so long I thought maybe they were gone. I forced myself to move inch by inch until I sat up. The glow of the stove had faded, leaving the cabin almost black. I thought I might relight the lantern, but then I froze. From the porch came the faintest sound. A breath. Not mine, not the wind. A slow, steady inhale, right on the other side of the door. My chest locked tight. Whoever was out there was standing still, close enough to touch the wood, listening. I didn't move again until dawn. When the light finally seeped through the window, I forced myself to the door. I opened it a crack and looked out. The prints were everywhere, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, pressed deep into the porch. They had stood there a long time, watching, listening. That was enough. I packed my things fast, barely caring how I stuffed them into my bag. I loaded the car, hands shaking, and drove down the dirt road without looking back. My tires slid on gravel, branches scraped the sides. I had been driving for almost 7 hours straight when I finally pulled off the narrow mountain road and turned onto the dirt track that led to the cabin. The air outside was already colder than I expected, and even though it was late summer, the higher elevation made it feel like fall. Dust kicked up behind the car as I crawled along the uneven path, the kind that made the tires crunch and thump with every loose stone. I kept checking the map I had printed out earlier, since my phone had long lost service on the way up, and every turn felt like it could be the wrong one. The track wound deeper through tall pines that blocked out most of the fading light. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had already dropped low, throwing a dull orange glow across the wooden roof. The cabin was small, older than I expected, with weathered logs stacked neatly, the kind that had been darkened by years of rain and sun. The windows were dusty, and the small porch leaned slightly to one side, like it had given in to time. I parked near the steps, killed the engine, and for the first time in hours, silence hit me. No car noise, No wind through an open window, nothing but the sound of the forest. Felt heavy, almost pressing. I hauled my bags inside, and the smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and a faint musty dampness, like the place had been shut for months without a window cracked open. The floorboards creaked under my boots, echoing through the small rooms. The cabin had one main living space with a fireplace on one wall, a tiny kitchen with a rusted sink, and a single bedroom with a bed frame that looked too thin to hold much weight. I set my bag down on the mattress, and the springs groaned as if complaining. The first thing I did was check the windows. Each one had latches, though some were stiff from rust. I forced them shut and tested them, making sure they locked. The door was solid but old, with a simple deadbolt that I turned back and forth a few times, listening to the metal scrape into place. Out here, I knew it was better to be cautious. It wasn't about being paranoid. It was about being prepared. The woods were empty, sure, but people came through places like this. Hunters, drifters, anyone who wanted somewhere to crash or get away unnoticed. By the time I had the place set up, night had already closed in. The forest outside went from green and shadowy to pitch black, like a wall beyond the windows. No porch light worked, so when I stepped out for a second, the darkness swallowed everything a few feet from the door. I didn't linger. Inside, I set a small lantern on the table, its glow spreading just enough to push back the shadows in the corners. I made something simple to eat, more out of habit than hunger, and sat at the table listening. The silence wasn't complete. The woods creaked and shifted, branches rubbed against each other, and now and then, I thought I heard something heavier, like the snap of a stick under weight. I told myself it was animals. Out here, deer and elk moved through without much care. Still, the sound carried differently when you were alone, and your mind filled the gaps. That night, I lay on the bed with my sleeping bag pulled over me, staring at the ceiling beams. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the cabin and every rustle outside kept me half awake. The night stretched longer than usual. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking the ground. It was something I had learned from camping trips. Look for signs, tracks, anything unusual. Sure enough, in the soft dirt near the tree line, there were prints. Not boots, but something heavier. They were wide, maybe a bear, but they came closer than I liked. I traced them with my eyes and saw they led toward the back of the cabin, then circled around before disappearing back into the woods. Bears didn't usually linger like that unless food was involved. I checked the trash bin near the porch, but it was empty, rusted, and hadn't been used in months. I shook it off, but the detail stuck with me. The day passed slow. I gathered some wood for the fireplace, checked the small shed beside the cabin, and found a few old tools. An axe, a shovel, some rusted nails and jars. The axe handle was worn smooth, but the blade was still sharp enough. I leaned it against the wall inside, where I could see it. It wasn't just for splitting wood anymore. That evening, as the sun dipped again, I noticed something new, a shape by the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't just a tree stump. It was upright, tall. I froze and squinted. It didn't move, though, and after a long minute, I convinced myself it was nothing more than a trunk shaped oddly. Still, I locked the door earlier that night. I fell asleep with the axe closer than before, propped beside the bed. Sometime deep in the night, I woke, not from a dream, from a sound, a faint crunch of gravel near the porch. My chest tightened as I lay still, listening. Another crunch. Someone or something was out there, close enough to be on the clearing. I resisted the urge to move or breathe too loud. The floor creaked in the cabin as I shifted, careful not to make noise, and I reached for the axe handle, gripping it tight. The steps didn't last long. After maybe a minute, silence fell again, heavy and complete. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle stiff, waiting for the next sound that never came. When the sun came up, I went outside, my stomach in knots. The dirt near the steps told the truth. Prints, not animal, not bear, boots, large ones, fresh. I followed them a short distance just to confirm, and they led into the trees. Whoever it was had been close. close enough to stand at my door if they wanted. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the thought. Someone knew I was here. Someone had come close enough to check the cabin but not knock, not say anything, not show themselves. That was worse than anything else. I checked the windows again and again, tested the lock on the door. I even dragged the small dresser from the bedroom and wedged it against the door as a barricade. My food bag I kept near me so nothing outside would be tempted to break in for it. That night was harder than the last. Couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me grip the axe tighter. Around midnight, I heard it again. Steps. Slow, circling, crunching in the dirt. This time closer to the back wall of the cabin. Then silence. Then a tap, faint but sharp, against one of the back windows. My skin went cold. I didn't move. Whoever it was didn't try again. After a while, the silence stretched so long I wondered if I imagined it. By morning, when I checked, more prints circled the cabin. Fresh again. Whoever it was hadn't left. I knew I couldn't stay much longer, but I also knew leaving wasn't simple. The road was long, narrow, and quiet. If someone followed me or blocked the way, I'd have nowhere to go. Out here, there was no service, no neighbors, no one to call. If I left at the wrong time, I might walk right into whoever had been circling me at night. I spent that whole day with the axe never leaving my side. I ate without tasting, drank water without noticing. I kept checking the tree line, waiting for movement. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat at the table with the lantern dimmed, axe across my lap, ears straining. Hours passed like that. Sometime near dawn, when the sky outside was just beginning to lighten, I heard it again. The crunch of boots, this time faster, moving toward the porch. Then the sound of the steps on the wood. I gripped the axe so hard my hands ached. The deadbolt rattled, the door pressing against the dresser I had wedged. The weight pushed, then stopped. Whoever it was tested it, then stepped back. Silence again, then nothing. When the sun was finally up, I opened the door and looked. Prints all over the porch, pressed deep into the wood dust. They had stood there long enough to leave several. That was it for me. I wasn't staying another night. I packed fast, shoving everything back into the car. My eyes never left the tree line, scanning for movement. The forest looked the same as always, tall and still, but I knew someone was in there, watching, waiting. I turned the engine over, and the sound shattered the silence. I backed up fast, turned onto the dirt track, and didn't look back at the cabin. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt, every bump of the road rattling through me. For miles, the trees pressed close, and I kept checking the mirror, certain I'd see a truck, a figure, something following. Nothing did. By the time the paved road came into view, my chest loosened a little, but not much. Whoever it was never showed themselves fully. They never spoke, never revealed what they wanted. But they had circled, tapped, tested the lock, tried the door. They had stood just feet away from where I was inside. Out here in the woods with no one else for miles, that was enough. I didn't stop until I was back in town, among traffic, lights, people. The kind of normal noise you don't notice until it's gone. That's when I finally breathed, but the tension never left completely. I knew I'd always remember the prints in the dirt, the steps on the porch. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The idea was simple. 3 days alone at a small cabin in the woods, far away from the noise and rush of town. I had rented the cabin online after seeing a few grainy pictures of it, tucked deep in a stretch of forest with no close neighbors. The listing had promised peace, quiet, and the kind of solitude I had been craving for a long time. The drive out there took most of the afternoon. By the time I turned off the main road onto the dirt path that led to the cabin, the sun was already low. The path was narrow, filled with potholes, and lined with tall trees on both sides that seemed to close in the deeper I drove. The cabin finally came into view after about 15 minutes of bumping along the uneven track. It was smaller than I had pictured, with weathered wood, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle, and a single dim light over the door that flickered as if it wasn't fully connected. I parked beside the cabin and stepped out. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The woods were quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves. No distant cars, no voices, no sign of anyone. The silence felt heavier than I had expected. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked up the creaking steps onto the porch. The door stuck a little when I pushed it open, and inside the air was stale, with that old wood-smell cabins seemed to hold. The cabin was one open space with a small kitchen area, a couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed tucked against the far wall. A single window looked out onto the trees. There was also a narrow door that led to a small bathroom. Everything looked clean enough, but it was plain, no decorations, no warmth to it. Just a functional space. I unpacked a few things, set them on the table, and walked around to get a better feel for the place. The floorboards groaned under every step. I noticed the lock on the door was just a flimsy latch, and the window didn't seem to close all the way. I pushed it down as far as it would go and left it at that. By the time I finished settling in, it was almost dark. I heated a can of soup on the small stove, ate it in silence, and then sat outside on the porch for a while. The woods were still. I could hear insects, a few birds, and occasionally the distant snap of a branch, probably from some animal moving through the brush. The air grew colder, and eventually I went back inside. That night, I lay on the bed listening to the creaks of the cabin. Every time the wind shifted, the wood seemed to groan in a new way. I told myself it was just the cabin adjusting to the night air. Still, it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the trees and into the window. I made coffee on the stove and stepped outside. The woods looked different in daylight, less intimidating. I walked around the cabin, noticing the ground was uneven, littered with pine needles and fallen branches. The cabin sat on a small rise, with the forest sloping downward behind it. From the back, you could barely see the roofline above the trees. After breakfast, I decided to explore. I walked down the slope, pushing through the underbrush until I reached a narrow animal trail. It wound deeper into the woods, and I followed it for a while, listening to the sounds of birds above. After maybe half an hour, I turned back. I didn't want to wander too far and risk losing track of where the cabin was. The rest of the day passed quietly. I read a book I had brought, made a simple lunch, and later gathered some fallen branches to start a small fire in the stone ring outside the cabin. By evening, I felt more relaxed. The isolation was starting to feel like what I had wanted, simple, quiet, away from everything. But that night was different. It started with a sound. I had been lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the faint crunch of leaves outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. But the steps didn't sound like the irregular movement of an animal. They sounded steady, slow, deliberate. I held my breath and listened. The steps moved closer to the cabin, then stopped. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, every muscle tense. After a long moment, I heard the faint creak of the porch steps. My chest tightened. The sound was soft but clear, the weight of someone stepping onto the porch. Then silence. I waited, straining to hear anything else. The door latch rattled gently, as if tested. Not forceful, just a slight movement. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would give me away. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I didn't hear the steps leave, but eventually, the woods went quiet again. I lay awake the rest of the night, staring into the darkness, every small sound making me jump. When morning finally came, I got up slowly and went to the door. The latch was still in place. I opened it and stepped outside. The porch boards looked the same, but when I looked down at the dirt in front of the steps, I saw it, faint impressions in the soil. Shoe prints, too large and too defined to be an animal. Someone had been there. I felt my stomach knot as I stared at them. They led up to the steps but didn't clearly lead away. The ground was disturbed, but it was hard to tell which direction the person had gone. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the unease. I tried to go about things normally, made breakfast, sat outside with my coffee, but I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Every sound seemed louder. Every shadow seemed like it could hide someone. By afternoon, I made up my mind to leave. But when I checked my car, I found the front tire was flat. I crouched down and saw a small cut in the rubber, too clean to be an accident. Someone had slashed it. I stood there staring at it, the woods pressing in silent and heavy around me. I felt a cold sweat on my back. I had no spare tire in the trunk. I had meant to replace it weeks ago, but never did. The nearest town was miles away. Walking there would mean hours through the woods and along the dirt road. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat at the table. My mind raced. Someone had been outside during the night. They had come onto the porch, touched the latch, and then cut the tire. They hadn't tried to break in, not yet. It was like they wanted me stuck there. The hours crawled by. I kept looking out the window, scanning the tree line. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something between the trees, but when I focused, it was gone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with the light off, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. The faint crunch of leaves, the soft steps on the porch. This time, they stayed longer. The door latch rattled harder, then stopped. Silence followed, heavy and drawn out. I sat frozen, gripping the edge of the couch. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, gray light was filtering through the window. The woods outside looked still and calm again, but I knew better now. When I stepped onto the porch, the shoe prints were back. More of them this time, circling the cabin. Whoever it was, they had walked around the cabin in the night over and over. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I stuffed my things into my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and started down the dirt road on foot. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Every step felt like it echoed. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following. After an hour, my legs burned, but I kept going. The dirt road stretched endlessly, winding between trees. Then I saw it, fresh shoe prints in the dust of the road. Not mine. They were ahead of me, leading the same direction I was walking. I stopped cold, staring at them. Whoever had been at the cabin was somewhere on this road, not far ahead. I turned back toward the cabin for a moment, then froze. Behind me, faint in the dirt, were more prints, following mine. I was trapped. Someone in front of me, someone behind. The woods pressed in close on either side, dark and endless. My only choice was to keep walking. My chest felt tight, my mind racing. I walked faster, my eyes darting between the prints in front of me and the silence behind. For hours, I pushed forward, until finally, I heard the faint hum of a car in the distance. I broke into a run, bursting out of the trees onto the main road. A truck slowed as it saw me, and I waved it down, gasping for breath. When I looked back at the dirt road, the trees swayed quietly, hiding everything inside. Whoever had been following me didn't step out. They just stayed hidden in the woods, watching. I never went back for the car. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. The small wooden cabin sat far back from the road, hidden behind thick trees and a narrow dirt path that most cars could barely get through without scratching up the paint. I had rented it mainly because of how private it was. The listing online had said no neighbors within a mile, no phone service, and only basic electricity from a solar setup. The idea of being cut off from everyone for a few days sounded peaceful. I wanted quiet. I wanted space to think. I wanted to be somewhere where I didn't hear traffic or see lights glowing through the windows at night. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The paved road turned into gravel, and the gravel turned into packed dirt with deep ruts where rainwater had cut into it. Branches brushed against the sides of my car, and I slowed to almost a crawl in certain spots. When I finally saw the cabin, it appeared suddenly through the trees, looking older and darker than the pictures had shown. It sat on a small clearing with grass growing unevenly around it. The wood was weathered gray and brown, the roof covered in pine needles. There was a single porch with 2 steps and a door with peeling paint. I parked beside the cabin and turned off the car. The quiet that followed was heavier than I expected. No wind, no sound of cars, only the faint rustle of leaves high up in the trees. For a while, I sat there in the driver's seat, just looking at the cabin and the trees pressing close behind it. The place felt smaller, more shut off from the world than it had in the photos. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a bed, a small kitchen counter, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a bathroom at the back with an old toilet and a shower that the listing had warned only worked with cold water. A single window faced the clearing out front, and another smaller one looked out into the trees behind. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, walked around the clearing, and collected some branches for the stove. I kept noticing how still everything was. No animals came close. I didn't see birds around the clearing either. When night came, the darkness was absolute. I had to use a flashlight even to move around inside the cabin. The one small solar light over the porch barely lit up the steps. I went to bed early, listening to the creaks of the cabin as it cooled. The second day, I woke up before sunrise. The cabin was cold, and I made a small fire in the stove. As the light came through the trees, I decided to explore the path behind the cabin. The dirt trail wound between tall pines and dipped into small hollows. I walked for nearly an hour before turning back. The trees seemed endless, pressing in from every side. By the third day, I had settled into the routine of being alone there. I cooked simple meals, read books I had brought, and wrote in a notebook. In the afternoons, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee and listened to the silence. I started noticing small details, the way the light changed through the branches, the sound of distant cracking when old limbs fell in the woods. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It started to feel thick, like it was hiding something. That night, I woke to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just the faint crunch of something moving in the clearing. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but the steps were slow, uneven. They came closer to the cabin, paused, then shifted again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, not daring to move. The sound circled around, faded, then stopped. In the morning, I looked out at the grass around the cabin. Near the porch, I saw impressions in the ground. They were shaped like footprints, though faint, as if someone had walked barefoot through the damp earth. The size looked like an adult's. I told myself they could have been old. Maybe someone else had stayed here before me and left them behind. Still, the sight unsettled me. The next night, I made sure the door was locked before bed. Again, I woke to noises, this time the creak of the porch steps. Slow, steady weight pressing down. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. Minutes dragged. At some point, I must have fallen back asleep because I woke in daylight. When I checked the porch, I saw a smear of dirt near the door, like a handprint brushed across the wood. I stood staring at it for a long time. There were no houses nearby, no cars, no trails that led to this place. Whoever had been out there, if someone really had come through miles of thick woods just to stand on the porch in the night. That day, I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was more than an hour's drive, and I had already paid for the cabin. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the sounds had been animals. Maybe the marks had been left long ago. I tried to keep busy, but every time I looked toward the tree line, I felt like eyes were on me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the flashlight clutched in my hand, listening. Hours passed. The fire in the stove burned low, and the cabin grew colder. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The creak of the porch, the faint scrape against the door. This time, there was a sound of breathing, slow, heavy, right outside the thin wooden wall. I wanted to call for help, but my phone had no signal here. I thought about running to the car, but the keys were on the counter, and I'd have to pass the front window to get there. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for the door to open. It never did. Eventually, the noises faded. In the morning, I found more footprints in the grass. Clearer this time, definite human prints, circling the cabin, stopping at the porch. I walked the clearing slowly, looking into the trees, but saw nothing. The forest stood silent, dense, and watchful. The following night was worse. The footsteps came earlier, before midnight. They moved around the cabin again, stopping, starting, as if whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. At one point, I heard something brush against the back window. When I finally dared to look, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a figure shifting between trunks, too far to make out clearly. By dawn, I was shaking from exhaustion. I packed my things quickly, stuffing them into bags. I planned to leave as soon as possible. When I opened the door, something caught my eye. On the porch, scratched lightly into the wood, was a symbol. 2 lines crossed over each other, rough and uneven. It looked like it had been done with a knife. I carried everything to the car, loaded it, and started the engine. The sound felt too loud in the still morning. I pulled out of the clearing, the dirt path bumping beneath the tires. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step into the road behind me. The trees closed in thick around the car. It took almost 20 minutes before I reached the gravel road again. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where other cars moved and cell service returned. When I finally checked my phone, I saw dozens of missed notifications trying to load all at once. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, breathing hard. I never reported what happened. I couldn't explain it clearly. No one would believe that someone had been walking around out there every night, leaving prints, marks, and symbols. I don't know if it was someone living hidden in those woods, or someone who had been watching the cabin, waiting for people to stay there. All I know is that I left, and I will never go back to a place that isolated again. The silence that I had once wanted so badly had turned into something else. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, silence wasn't peace. It was a warning. I had been needing time away from everything for a while. Work had been pressing down on me harder than usual, and the noise of the city had started to feel like a constant drill running through my head. I wanted peace and quiet, a place where I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. So I booked a few days at a small cabin in the woods. I did not know much about it other than it was listed as remote and basic, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive there already made me feel uneasy. The road narrowed the deeper I went, and soon it was just a thin path twisting between tall trees. The branches hung over the road in some places, scratching the sides of my car as if they were trying to hold me back. The farther I went, the more I noticed how little traffic there was. In fact, after turning onto the forest road, I did not see another vehicle at all. The cell service cut off not long after. I kept driving, watching my fuel gauge, hoping the directions I had were accurate because there were no signs, no houses, nothing but woods. The cabin appeared suddenly after a sharp bend, sitting in a clearing surrounded by thick pines. It was small, with a pitched roof, wooden steps, and a porch that sagged a little on one side. The logs were weathered and dark, the kind that had seen years of rain and snow. There was a stone chimney, and the windows had wooden shutters, most of them closed. It looked lonely, and I felt a kind of hesitation before shutting off my engine. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of my car cooling down. I unloaded my bags and carried them inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single room with a small kitchen area on one side, a wood stove in the middle, and a bed pushed against the wall. There was a narrow door at the back that led to what I guessed was a small bathroom. Everything looked aged but usable. I tried to comfort myself by thinking that this was what I wanted. No noise, no people, just nature and quiet. First, it was exactly that. I spent the first couple of hours setting my things down, checking the cabinets and making sure the stove worked. There was a stack of firewood outside, though most of it was damp from old rain. I walked around the clearing, taking in the tall trees that circled the place. The woods were dense, so thick in some parts that the sunlight barely touched the ground. The quiet was overwhelming, but in a strange way, it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made every sound noticeable. The crack of a twig somewhere behind the trees felt louder than it should. My own footsteps seemed out of place. As evening came, I made something simple to eat and lit a fire in the stove. The orange glow filled the cabin, pushing back the shadows that seemed to crowd the corners. I sat on the bed with a book, but I kept getting distracted by noises outside. a snapping branch, a rustle of leaves. Could have been animals, but the longer I listened, the less it felt natural. The sounds came in short bursts, then stopped, as if something was waiting. I kept telling myself it was deer or maybe raccoons. Still, I found myself getting up several times to look out through the cracks of the shutters, scanning the tree line. Each time, I saw nothing but darkness. That first night, I did not sleep well. Every little noise kept me awake. The wind brushed against the walls. Something scratched lightly on the porch. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps moving slowly across the clearing. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, staring at the door. My heart pounded hard, and I stayed frozen for a long time. When nothing happened, I told myself I was letting my imagination run too far. Eventually, I drifted into a shallow sleep. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I made coffee and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, the grass still wet with dew. Everything looked harmless in the daylight. I told myself that maybe I was just not used to the deep woods, that my mind was exaggerating simple forest sounds. I decided to go for a walk and explore. I followed a faint trail leading away from the cabin. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen leaves. The deeper I went, the more closed in it felt. The trees pressed closer together, and the light grew dimmer even though it was morning. After walking for about an hour, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of other people. No campsites, no old fire pits, not even trash. It was as if no one came this way. Then I noticed something that made me stop. Off the trail, a little way into the trees, there was a tree trunk with strange markings. The bark had been cut with deep lines, not random scratches but deliberate cuts. They looked like crude symbols or shapes. I walked closer, running my hand over them. The cuts were rough, but they were not new. Some of the edges had darkened with age. I looked around, half expecting to see more, but the woods were still. I kept walking, uneasy now, until I decided I had gone far enough. On the way back, I paid more attention, and I realized there were other trees with similar marks. Some had slashes, some had almost circle-like carvings. I did not understand what they meant, but they did not look like anything natural. By the time I made it back to the cabin, I felt a heavy unease that I could not shake. That night was worse. I kept hearing noises outside, but they were different from the night before. It was not random. It sounded like slow, steady steps moving around the cabin. Sometimes they would stop, then start again from another side. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, gripping the flashlight I had brought. I thought about stepping outside, but the fear of what I might see kept me frozen in place. The footsteps went on for what felt like hours before finally fading away. When morning came, I forced myself to check outside. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and I found prints near the cabin. They were not boots, but they were not animal either. They looked like bare feet, pressed into the mud, circling the cabin. Some of them came right up to the porch steps. My stomach turned when I realized they were fresh. Someone had been walking barefoot around the cabin in the middle of the night. I felt a wave of panic, but I tried to stay calm. I thought maybe there was some explanation, maybe kids messing around, though the cabin was too far from anywhere for that to make sense. I had no service, no way to call anyone. My only option was to leave early, but the thought of packing everything and driving out on those empty roads almost felt worse. I decided to stay one more night, but I told myself I would leave in the morning. That day, I tried to keep busy. I chopped some of the damp firewood to dry it out. I checked the cupboards, counted the food I had left. I kept looking out into the trees, waiting to see someone, but the woods stayed silent. I tried to rest in the afternoon, but I could not stop thinking about the footprints. As darkness fell again, I locked the door and placed a chair against it, even though it felt useless. I sat with the flashlight in one hand and a heavy iron poker from the stove in the other. Hours passed, and I kept hearing faint noises, but I told myself I would not look. I would not feed the fear. Then, sometime past midnight, there was a sound on the porch. A slow, heavy step on the wooden boards. The sound of weight shifting. Then another step. I held my breath, gripping the poker so tightly my hand hurt. The steps reached the door and stopped. The wood creaked under the weight. I sat frozen, staring at the door, every muscle in my body stiff. Minutes passed, but it felt like forever. Then the handle of the door rattled lightly. The chair against the door shook. Someone was testing it. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. After a long moment, the rattling stopped. The steps moved slowly off the porch. I listened as they circled the cabin again, fading into the trees. I stayed awake until the faint light of dawn started to appear through the shutters. When morning came, I stepped outside carefully. There were more footprints in the mud, more than before, circling the cabin again and again. They looked as if whoever it was had walked around for hours. I felt sick. I packed my bags as quickly as I could, throwing everything into the car without caring about order. My hands were shaking the whole time. As I drove away down the narrow forest road, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the path behind me. The woods stayed silent, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched the entire way. I did not stop until I reached the main road miles away, and when I finally got cell service back, I pulled over and just sat there, breathing hard. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone walked barefoot around my cabin at night? That there were carvings in the trees? They would probably dismiss it as nothing. But to me, it was not nothing. I know what I saw and I know what I heard. Whoever was out there was watching me. They knew where I was, and they came right up to the door. I do not know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I do not want to know. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. I had been planning to spend a week alone in the cabin for months. The idea was simple: a quiet break away from the noise of daily life. No phone calls, no work, no endless background noise from the city. I wanted silence, space, and time to myself. I thought I knew exactly what I was getting into. I had been to the cabin once before during the daytime to check it out. It was a small wooden place set back off a dirt road, surrounded by forest and hills, maybe 40 minutes from the nearest small town. It was the kind of cabin that had no electricity except for a small generator, no running water except for what you carried in jugs or pumped from the hand well outside, and only a wood stove for heat. I liked the idea of roughing it a little. I thought it would be refreshing to strip things down and just focus on basic living for a while. I drove up on a gray morning, the air damp from rain the night before. The dirt road that led to the cabin was narrow and soft, with puddles filling the low spots. The trees pressed close on both sides, branches leaning overhead and making it feel like I was entering a tunnel. It was colder than I thought it would be for late autumn. The leaves had mostly dropped already, so the woods had a bare and exposed feeling, branches black and wet against the gray sky. I remember thinking how quiet it was when I shut the car off. No highway noise, no planes, no voices. Just my breathing, the tick of the car's cooling engine, and the faint rustle of wind in the branches. The cabin looked the same as when I had last seen it. Dark brown wood, green roof, small porch with one step missing on the side. The front door stuck a little when I opened it, and the inside smelled of old pine, smoke, and something faintly damp, like the cabin hadn't been used in a long while. I set my bags down on the wooden floor, the sound echoing slightly because of the emptiness of the place. There was only the main room with a wood stove, a table, a couple of chairs, a small shelf with some old pans and dishes, and a sleeping area in the back with a cot. I unpacked slowly, setting up the food I had brought, stacking the wood I had purchased near the stove, and checking the water jugs I carried in. The first day passed quietly. I walked the area around the cabin, checked the trails, and made sure I knew the way back to the road. The ground was soft and covered with wet leaves, and I noticed boot tracks in the mud that didn't look like mine. They were older, the edges softened by rain, but they were big, wider than my shoes. At the time, I thought maybe a hunter had been through or someone else had come to check the cabin before me. I didn't give it much more thought, though the sight of them stuck in my mind longer than I expected. That night was the first time I realized how different the dark felt out there. Once the sun went down, the cabin seemed swallowed in blackness. Even with the lantern I brought, the windows were just dark squares, and the woods beyond them felt endless. The sound of wind in the trees grew louder, and every creak of the wood stove or shifting of the cabin frame seemed sharper. I lay in the cot with my sleeping bag pulled tight around me, listening. It was a different kind of listening than I ever did in the city. There, you hear noise constantly and filter most of it out. Out here, there was silence broken only by distinct sounds. A branch snapping, a rustle of leaves, the faint groan of wood outside. My heart beat faster than usual, and I had trouble falling asleep. The next morning, I went to the well pump about 20 yards from the cabin to get water. As I leaned to work the handle, I noticed fresh boot prints in the mud around the pump. They weren't mine. I stood there staring at them for a long time. They were deep, as if someone heavier had stood there recently, and the edges were sharp, not softened by rain or time. I felt a wave of unease spread through me. If someone had been at the pump, then they had been only steps away from the cabin while I slept. I looked around the trees, scanning the empty woods. Nothing moved. The silence pressed in on me. I carried the water back and tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe just an old print I hadn't noticed the day before. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how vulnerable the cabin was. No locks worth anything, just thin wooden walls, and nothing but wilderness for miles. I decided to keep my eyes open and maybe cut my stay short if it felt wrong. As the day passed, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the woods. I thought I saw movement once, just a flicker of shape between trees, but when I stared hard, there was nothing. The air felt colder, sharper, and I noticed that the woods had gone very quiet. Even the birds weren't singing much. That night was worse. I built a strong fire in the stove, sat near it, and tried to read, but my mind wouldn't focus. Every sound outside drew my attention. At some point, I heard the crunch of footsteps on leaves near the cabin. My chest tightened instantly. I sat frozen, holding my breath, listening. The steps came slow, irregular, circling. I thought I heard them stop just outside the window. I didn't dare move. The lantern light flickered, and I stared at the black square of glass, half expecting a face to appear. Nothing did. After several minutes, the sounds faded, but I couldn't be sure if it was someone moving away or just standing silently out there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with the lantern low, the hatchet I had brought for splitting wood gripped in my hands, and waited for dawn. My body ached from tension, and every muscle was sore. When light finally came, I stepped outside slowly. The ground around the cabin showed prints, boot tracks circling, stopping near windows, then moving back toward the trees. My stomach dropped when I saw how clear they were. Someone had been there, watching. The next hours were a blur of fear and decision. I thought about leaving immediately, but the dirt road was long and muddy, and my car wasn't in great shape. If I got stuck, I'd be even more exposed. I decided to wait until midday, when the ground might dry a little, then pack up and go. I started to gather my things, stuffing them back into bags, keeping the hatchet close at all times. But before I could finish, I heard it again, the sound of someone moving in the trees. This time it was broad daylight. I froze and crouched near the window, peeking out. At first I saw nothing. Then, far back between the trees, I spotted a figure. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes. He wasn't moving toward the cabin, just standing, half hidden behind a tree, watching. My mouth went dry. I stayed low, trying not to be seen. When I looked again, he was gone. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay another night. I loaded my bags, shut off the stove, and tried to keep calm. My hands shook as I locked the cabin door, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined. I walked fast to the car, scanning the trees the whole time. Every shadow seemed like it might hold someone. When I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine took longer than usual to catch. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd pass out before it started. Finally, it roared to life and I pulled out fast, mud spraying behind the tires. The drive back down the dirt road was the longest of my life. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone following on foot or a truck pulling up behind me. My hands gripped the wheel until they hurt. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't relax. I drove straight through to town, only stopping when I reached a gas station with people around. I sat there in the car, hands still shaking, realizing how close I had come to something I didn't even want to imagine. Whoever had been out there wasn't just passing by. They had circled the cabin at night, come to the well, stood in the trees during the day. They had been watching me. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't anything good. I never went back to that cabin again. Even now, years later, when I think about it, my chest tightens. I remember the silence of the woods, the sound of those slow footsteps in the leaves, the prints circling the windows. I think about how easy it would have been for someone to come inside while I slept. I think about how isolated I was, with no one to hear me if something happened. I tell myself I was lucky, that leaving when I did saved me from whatever might have come next. That week I planned to spend in peace and quiet turned into the scariest experience of my life. It taught me something I'll never forget. Silence and isolation aren't always peaceful. Sometimes they mean someone else is out there waiting, and you're too far from help to stop them. I remember the first time I saw that cabin from the distance. It was early afternoon, the sun low but still bright enough to throw long beams across the valley. The cabin sat in a clearing at the bottom of a slow slope, hidden between tall firs and patches of birch. From where I stood, it looked small, almost swallowed by the woods around it. The roof looked weathered, a patch of rust on one side where metal sheets had been nailed down to keep water out. I had rented it for a week, thinking it would give me peace and quiet. I wanted nothing more than to be away from the city, away from the noise, away from everything. The dirt road that led down toward it was uneven and muddy from recent rains. My truck bounced hard over every dip. There were puddles with a slick film over them, some reflecting back the pale sky above. When I parked beside the cabin, I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, listening. At first, there was nothing, just that strange hollow silence you only get deep in the woods. But after a while, I could hear the faint rustling of branches, the cry of a bird far away, and the sharp buzz of insects close by. The cabin itself was rough. It was built from dark logs that had gone gray with age. The steps up to the porch sagged in the middle and the railings looked loose. The windows were streaked with dirt and dust, and the screen door was bent at the corner. Inside, the smell hit me first. Old wood, dampness, and something like mold that had been baked into the place for years. There was a single room with a stove, a small table, a bed pushed against the far wall, and a closet that leaned slightly forward. I unloaded my bags and stacked them by the bed. The sheets looked clean but rough, more like canvas than anything soft. The stove still had ashes inside, and the woodpile out back looked half-rotten. I wasn't planning on needing much anyway, since I had brought my own propane stove and plenty of food. That first day passed slowly. I walked the property, checked the tree line, and listened to the sounds around me. The woods were thicker than I expected. When I stepped even a little way in, the light dimmed so quickly that it felt like dusk. The ground was soft with old needles and moss, and I could hear water trickling somewhere deeper in. I thought about exploring but decided to wait until morning. The first night was strange. Lying on the bed, I could hear every sound outside, every creak of wood, every gust of wind against the walls, every knock of a loose branch against the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was normal, but my chest felt tight, and I couldn't close my eyes for long without jerking them open again. At one point around midnight, I heard what sounded like movement in the leaves, close, too close, right outside the cabin. It wasn't heavy like a bear. It was lighter like steps, slow, deliberate. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath, staring at the ceiling. The noise lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I didn't move again until dawn. The next morning, I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself it had been a deer or some animal passing through. I walked farther into the woods, following the slope toward the sound of water I had heard the day before. After maybe half a mile, I found a creek, the water cold and clear, running fast over stones. I knelt and washed my hands, felt the sting of cold, and filled a bottle. The ground there was soft, muddy in places, with broken branches scattered around. I noticed something that made me stop. A clear footprint in the mud. It wasn't fresh, but it was sharp enough to make out. A boot print. Human, not mine. The tread was different. Deepa vida. Someone else had been there not long ago. I stood for a while, staring at it, feeling the silence around me grow heavier. Then I turned back to the cabin. That day I tried to keep busy, chopping some of the dry wood, cleaning the inside of the cabin, boiling water for later. But my eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the tree line, to the places where I thought I saw movement. At dusk, I forced myself to cook and eat, though my stomach felt tight. When darkness came again, the silence grew thicker, as though the night pressed against the walls. This time, the sounds came later. It must have been past 1 in the morning when I heard them. First, faint crunching in the leaves outside. Then, closer, the sound of wood shifting on the porch. My whole body went rigid. The floor creaked as though weight was pressing down on it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It lasted maybe a minute, then silence again. When morning came, I walked around the cabin. On the porch, near the steps, the dirt had been disturbed. Small patches of mud were pressed down, smeared as though someone had stepped there, then turned. I knelt and touched it. It wasn't an animal. The shape was too straight. It was a boot print, faint but real. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Someone had been on the porch while I was inside. The next days bled into each other. I barely slept, barely ate. I spent hours sitting by the window, staring out, waiting. I kept hearing sounds, sometimes faint, sometimes close. Branches snapping, leaves shifting. Once, something heavy brushing against the wall outside. I started noticing other things too. Small details. The woodpile looked disturbed one morning. Logs shifted as though someone had tried to take some. A rusty can that I'd left by the stove was missing, and later I found it outside, crushed flat. Once, when I came back from the creek, I thought I saw movement by the cabin. A figure slipping into the trees, but when I ran toward it, nothing was there. I began to feel like I was being watched every second, even in daylight, especially in daylight. By the 5th night, I was shaking from exhaustion. My hands wouldn't stay steady. I sat on the bed with the lantern turned low, staring at the door. At some point, I must have drifted off, because a sound snapped me awake. A scrape, faint knock. The door handle moved, turned, slow, steady. I froze, my body locked in place. The door didn't open, it was locked, but the handle twisted, rattled, then stopped. I sat there in silence, heart hammering so hard it felt like it shook the bed. The footsteps moved away after that, but I knew it wasn't an animal. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay much longer. I started packing, but part of me didn't want to leave just yet. Felt like I needed to know. I needed to be sure. I told myself maybe it was just hunters, maybe some drifter passing through, but the signs were too clear. Someone was coming back night after night, watching, waiting. That evening, I stayed awake with the lantern out, sitting by the window with my flashlight in my hand. The woods were black, the kind of black that feels solid. Every sound made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I saw movement at the tree line. A figure, still, watching. I gripped the flashlight but didn't turn it on. My chest felt crushed, my breathing shallow. The figure didn't move for what felt like forever, just stood there. Then, slowly, it turned and slipped back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all after that. At first light, I packed everything fast, loaded it into the truck, and didn't look back. My hands shook the whole drive out. The dirt road felt longer than before, every shadow heavy. When I finally hit the paved road, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, trying to breathe. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when I told myself it was safe, I looked up the place online. The listing was gone. I checked forums, local posts, anything. I found nothing. No one knew about it, no one had stayed there, no one had even heard of it being rented. The memory that sticks with me most isn't the nights I lay awake listening, or the sound of the handle turning. It's that one image, the figure standing at the tree line, still watching me, waiting for me to break. And the worst part is knowing that if I hadn't left when I did, maybe they would have stopped waiting. Maybe they would have come inside. I drove into the mountains later than I should have. The road stretched out in long curves, and the higher I climbed, the more the trees crowded in. Heavy pines mixed with thinner, younger growth. The cabin I had rented was supposed to be deep in the valley on the other side of the ridge, and I remember checking the fuel gauge twice because I did not want to end up stranded on a lonely mountain road at night. It was almost dark when I finally reached the small gravel lane that turned off from the main road. My headlights lit up the hanging branches, and I slowed to a crawl, worried about scraping the car or bottoming out on loose rocks. The cabin was supposed to be a small wooden place near a creek, simple and isolated. I had planned to stay for 4 days just to clear my head. I had food in the trunk, water, some tools, a sleeping bag, and enough gear to make it comfortable. At the time, I was looking forward to silence, but I didn't understand then how silence can turn against you if you sit with it too long. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already night. My headlights washed over the front porch, showing old wooden steps, a sloping roof, and a door that looked slightly crooked on its hinges. The cabin sat lower than the lane, tucked in a shallow hollow where the trees leaned close. I turned off the car, and the instant the engine stopped, the quiet wrapped around me. Not city quiet, not even country quiet, but that kind of deep, pressing silence where even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. I carried my bags inside with a flashlight. The air smelled of wood rot and old smoke. The cabin was one room with a small loft above, a stone fireplace against one wall, and 2 windows facing the creek. The furniture was simple. 1 wooden table, 2 chairs, a single narrow bed frame with a lumpy mattress, and shelves made from rough planks. There were mouse droppings in the corners, and the boards creaked with every step. I unpacked quickly, put my cooler on the table, and checked the fireplace. There was old ash inside, so someone had used it not too long ago. I had brought firewood in the trunk because I didn't trust what might be left behind. I lit a small fire to push the dampness out of the air, then sat down with a sandwich. That first night passed without much trouble. I lay awake for a while, listening to the creek outside and the occasional groan of the wood shifting as the cabin warmed from the fire. I thought about how cut off it felt already, how no one would pass by here unless they were looking for it. That thought sat with me longer than I liked. The next morning I woke early, stiff from the thin mattress. The air was cold enough that my breath hung in front of me. I went outside to wash my face at the creek. Mist hung low across the water, and the trees on the opposite bank looked like they were leaning forward. There were no other cabins in sight, no fences, no power lines. I felt like I was in a pocket of land forgotten by everyone else. The plan was simple: read, write, walk along the valley trails, and be alone. I cooked oatmeal on the fire, wrote a few notes in my journal, then hiked up the nearest ridge with a small pack. From the top, I could see the creek twisting through the valley, and the cabin sitting small and dark at the bend. I remember thinking how small it looked, how easy it would be to miss it entirely if you didn't know it was there. The day passed quietly. I returned, made a fire again, and sat outside on the steps as the sky darkened. That was when I first felt it. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the air. The forest, which had been filled with the faint noises of birds and insects during the day, went still all at once. The silence wasn't like night settling in. It was sharper, heavier. I stared into the trees, expecting to see a deer or maybe a bear, but there was nothing. I tried to brush it off, but I caught myself scanning the tree line again and again until full darkness came. That night, I had more trouble sleeping. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something crunching on gravel. The lane leading down to the cabin was covered in loose stone, and the noise was distinct. I froze, listening hard, and after a few seconds it stopped. I waited a long time, but there was no knock, no light, no sound of an engine. Eventually, I told myself it must have been an animal moving through the brush. Still, I couldn't shake the idea that it had sounded like footsteps. The next day, I went walking again, this time down along the creek. The ground was soft, and in a patch of mud I noticed boot prints. They weren't mine. I had only been wearing trail runners, and these prints were larger, deeper, and set in a clear line heading toward the cabin. I followed them for a while until they cut into the trees and faded. My skin prickled as I stood there, looking at them. I told myself that maybe the property owner had walked through recently, or maybe another hiker had come down this way. But the prints were fresh, edges still sharp. When I got back to the cabin, I walked around it carefully. On the far side, near the smaller window, the earth was disturbed. The leaves were pressed down, and I thought I saw the faint impression of another shoe print there too. I didn't like that at all. That night, I barricaded the door with one of the chairs. I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted in, but it made me feel slightly better. I lay in my sleeping bag on top of the mattress, staring at the ceiling and listening. For hours, nothing happened. Then, sometime deep in the night, I heard it again, crunching gravel, faint, pausing, then crunching again. It stopped right outside. I didn't breathe. I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears. There was no knock, no voice, just stillness. After what felt like forever, I heard the gravel again, this time moving away up the lane. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting upright with the flashlight in my hand. By morning, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to check the lane. Sure enough, there were prints in the gravel, the same heavy boots, coming down to the cabin, stopping, and then turning back. The next 2 days blurred together. I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire small to avoid drawing attention, but smoke still rose through the chimney. I ate quickly, always glancing toward the windows. Several times during the day, I thought I saw movement among the trees, but I could never be sure. At night, the crunch of gravel came again, sometimes closer, sometimes further, always stopping short of a knock on the door. On the last night, I knew I had to make a choice. I could stay inside, waiting, or I could leave in the dark. I decided to wait for dawn and then get out as quickly as I could. I packed my bag, loaded everything back into the car, and sat ready. Around 3 in the morning, the sound came again, but this time it didn't stop at the lane. Slow, deliberate steps moved across the porch. The wood creaked under the weight. Then silence. I held the flashlight, aimed at the door, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I waited for the handle to turn, but it never did. Whoever it was just stood there. Minutes dragged into an hour. My legs cramped, my throat was dry, and every part of me screamed to run, but I didn't move. Finally, near dawn, the porch creaked again, softer this time, and the gravel crunched as the steps retreated. When the first gray light touched the trees, I didn't waste another second. I threw open the door, sprinted to the car, and drove up the lane without looking back. As I reached the ridge, I glanced once in the mirror. The cabin sat small and quiet in the valley, smoke from the last fire still drifting out. The porch was empty. The gravel was marked with prints again, heavy and fresh, leading right up to the door. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until I saw other cars and power lines and signs of normal life. I never went back, and the worst part is, I still don't know if they ever meant to come inside, or if standing there in the silence was all they wanted. I had been driving for hours that morning, down the winding back roads that cut through the thick woods and low valleys. The air was warm but carried that heavy dampness of late summer, the kind that made every breath feel weighted with moisture. My plan was simple enough. Spend a few days alone at a rented cabin tucked deep in the forest, far away from the sound of traffic, phones, and the steady noise of life back in the city. I wanted quiet, I wanted stillness, and I thought I had prepared for that. What I didn't understand when I locked the cabin door behind me for the first time was how quiet could take on a different shape when you were all alone in it. The cabin itself was simple, a single-story wooden structure sitting low on the slope of a valley, surrounded by thick pines and tall weeds that brushed against the porch posts. The roof sloped forward into a small porch with 2 rocking chairs, and a single dirt path cut its way down to the gravel drive where I parked my truck. The boards on the porch creaked when I stepped across them, and I remember thinking the sound was comforting at first, the wayward groans under weight. I could smell the faint musk of the place right away, a mix of old timber, mildew, and the faint tang of ash left over from wood fires long gone cold. Inside, the cabin was dim even during the afternoon. Heavy curtains hung thick over the windows, and when I opened them a little, the trees pressed in so tightly that only streaks of sunlight managed to break through the branches. Dust hung in the air and swirled in those thin beams, settling on the rough wooden floors and the mismatched furniture. The place wasn't built for comfort, at least not the kind most people were used to. It had a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, a wood stove, and a cabinet stocked with basic utensils and supplies. I had brought everything else I thought I'd need: canned food, water jugs, matches, a lantern, a heavy flashlight, a hatchet, and a sleeping bag just in case the mattress looked questionable. First, I settled in easily. I stacked my gear neatly, opened the windows to air the place out, and walked the perimeter of the cabin. The weeds pressed high against the walls, and I could see where animals had brushed through them. Deer, maybe raccoons, maybe things larger. The forest smelled alive, damp earth and pine resin and the faint sweetness of wildflowers somewhere unseen. The cabin sat low in a clearing, and the tree line pressed close on all sides. From the porch, you couldn't see beyond the first few layers of trunks. The air was heavy with the sound of cicadas, constant and buzzing, and every once in a while a bird would call sharp from the distance. The first few hours felt like what I wanted, still, quiet, separate. I ate a quick meal, stretched out on the porch, and let the weight of the forest settle on me. By the time evening came, the sky burned orange through the trees, then dimmed into blue. The cicadas eased, frogs picked up, and soon enough the forest was covered in that low blanket of nighttime noise. That first night, I felt the quiet in a different way. I locked the cabin door, lit the lantern, and listened to the night press close around the thin walls. Every little sound outside became sharper: the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the slow creak of the porch settling. At home, I could always sort out what was what: the passing of a car, a neighbor shutting a door, wind hitting the siding. Out there, though, everything felt unknown. I told myself it was just animals. Maybe a raccoon digging, maybe a deer brushing past. But every sound came with weight, the kind that pressed against your chest when you were alone. I lay in bed listening, the lantern turned low on the table. The mattress sagged in the middle, and the sheets smelled faintly of mildew even after I shook them out. My flashlight rested close to my hand, pointed at the door. The hours dragged. I don't know if I slept well or at all that night, because it felt like every time my eyes shut, I'd snap them open again at the sound of something outside. Once, I heard what sounded like steady footsteps on the dirt by the porch, soft but clear in the silence. They paused, and I held my breath, not daring to move. Then the sound drifted away, or maybe it was just the frogs and my ears fooling me. Eventually, the gray light of morning came through the curtains, and I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. By daylight, everything seemed harmless again. I stepped outside barefoot, the grass wet with dew, and looked around the clearing. Nothing seemed disturbed, no sign of anyone or anything. My truck sat just as I left it. Still, I caught myself scanning the ground for footprints, anything that might prove what I thought I'd heard. The dirt was packed hard, weeds bent by the dew, but nothing clear showed itself. The second day, I tried to distract myself. I chopped some wood, walked the edges of the forest path, and even followed a small trail that cut into the trees for a while. It was quiet and thick in there, the kind of quiet where every snap of a twig underfoot sounded loud. I noticed the air felt cooler under the canopy, and I couldn't see far before the trunks walled me in. After half an hour, I turned back, feeling uneasy with how quickly the forest seemed to swallow sound. That night, the unease came back worse. I shut the door, slid the bolt, and sat with the lantern glow casting shadows on the walls. The sounds outside came earlier this time. A scrape on the porch boards, a dull thump like something brushing against the wall. My chest tightened as I sat still, listening hard. The hair on my arms stood on end. Then silence again, deep and heavy, until I wasn't sure if I had really heard anything at all. Hours passed like that. Small sounds, then silence, my heart jumping with each one. Once, I heard the faintest creak, like weight shifting on wood, the same kind the porch made under my own steps. I stared at the door until my eyes watered, flashlight tight in my grip. My throat was dry, and I kept swallowing against it. Again, when morning came, the light made it all feel distant and strange. But on the third day, I found something that didn't sit right. When I stepped out onto the porch, I saw the dirt patch near the steps carried fresh marks. At first, I thought they were just deer prints, but the shape wasn't right. They looked like shoe prints, faint but clear enough to tell. Not boots, not deep treads, more like flat-soled shoes, the kind you'd wear in town. The prints came up to the steps, paused, then turned away into the weeds. I froze there, staring at them, my stomach sinking. Nobody was supposed to be near this cabin. The rental had been clear about that. Private land, no nearby houses, no trails cutting through. I walked around slowly, scanning the ground, and I found more in the weeds, bent grass pressed flat where someone had stood or moved through. The rest of that day, I couldn't settle. Every creak of the cabin made me jerk my head up. I kept checking the windows, scanning the tree line. I couldn't shake the image of someone standing out there just beyond the first line of trees, watching. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling clung to me. I stayed outside less, and when evening came, I locked the door early, my chest already tight. That night was worse than the others. I sat awake for hours, the lantern burning lower, the air in the cabin heavy and warm. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Soft steps in the dirt. Slow, steady, moving along the porch. The boards creaked under weight. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might echo in the room. I raised the flashlight, pointing it at the door, but I didn't move closer. The steps paused. Then came a dull scratch at the wall. Long, dragging, like fingertips or something rough brushing the boards. I didn't move, barely breathed. My mouth was dry, my skin prickled with cold sweat. The scratching stopped, and for a long stretch, silence filled everything. I couldn't hear frogs, couldn't hear cicadas, just a blanket of quiet so heavy it felt unnatural. Then, faintly, the boards creaked again, softer this time, until I couldn't tell if it was real or my own blood rushing in my ears. I sat there until the gray light of morning came again, and only then did I lower the flashlight. My hands shook when I reached for the lantern. I didn't go outside right away. I sat frozen for another hour, waiting, listening, before I dared unlatch the bolt. When I finally stepped out, the prints were back. Clearer this time, in the damp dirt. They circled the porch, stopped at the window, then trailed back into the weeds. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. My food was still stacked neatly. My truck sat untouched, but nothing about the air felt right anymore. I moved quickly, throwing my gear into the truck bed, every sound of the forest sending jolts through me. I didn't take time to look back at the cabin. I slid behind the wheel, turned the ignition, and pulled away fast, gravel spitting from the tires. As the road wound out of the valley, I gripped the wheel tighter, my eyes flicking to the mirrors. I didn't see anyone, no figure stepping from the trees, no car following. But in the rearview mirror, the image of those faint shoe prints circled the cabin again and again. I had wanted quiet. I had wanted stillness. But what I found... I had been looking forward to some time alone in the woods for a while. Life had felt like a constant cycle of noise, city streets, and people everywhere, and I wanted nothing more than to get away from all of it. I had managed to rent a small cabin deep in the woods, a place that had no neighbors close by and was advertised as quiet and secluded. It was an older cabin, nothing fancy, but it had running water, electricity, and the basics for cooking. That was all I needed. My plan was simple. Spend a week there, hike a little, read, maybe fish at the small lake nearby, and let myself reset. The drive itself felt long. Once I left the highway, the paved road turned into cracked asphalt, and eventually into a dirt road that twisted endlessly between tall pines and thick brush. The further I drove, the more I realized how far away I was going from anything familiar. My phone service began cutting in and out. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, I had no bars at all. The place looked like something from another time. Weathered wooden siding, a tin roof, and a front porch with a single rocking chair. The clearing around it was small, surrounded by trees so thick that it almost felt like the woods were pressing in on me. Inside, it smelled of wood and dust. The furniture was old but solid. A couch, a couple of chairs, a small table. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress and a dresser that had probably been there for decades. I unpacked my things slowly, getting used to the silence. It was the kind of silence that was almost heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the trees outside or the distant call of a bird. The first day passed without anything strange. I explored the lake, sat on the porch, and enjoyed the peace. That night, however, was different. Sleeping in the cabin wasn't easy. The darkness felt heavier than it ever did in the city. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, no background hum of people living nearby. There was only the forest, and the forest had its own noises. Twigs snapping, branches shifting, something moving through the leaves. I kept telling myself it was deer or raccoons, normal wildlife, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I barely slept. The second day, I tried to shake it off. I went hiking along a trail that ran deeper into the forest. The trail was narrow and poorly marked, but I wanted the exercise. After an hour or so, I came across something strange. Off to the side of the trail, hidden partly by overgrowth, was what looked like an old fire pit. Around it were some beer cans, crushed and rusting, and a few broken glass bottles. They looked like they had been there for a long time, maybe years. That wasn't too strange by itself. People camp in the woods all the time. What made me pause were the bones. They were small, probably animal bones, but they were piled near the pit in a way that didn't look random. It looked intentional. I stood there for a long time, staring, trying to decide if it was worth worrying about. Eventually, I convinced myself it wasn't unusual. Maybe hunters had left them there. I moved on, though I couldn't quite shake the feeling that it was unsettling. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the far edge of the clearing, just before the treeline, was a faint path leading into the woods. It was narrow and partly hidden, as if it wasn't meant to be noticed. I hadn't seen it when I arrived, maybe because I had been too focused on the cabin itself. I walked a little closer, but stopped before entering. The path looked well-trodden, like people used it often. For some reason, that bothered me more than the bones had. Who would be out here using a path this close to the cabin when the cabin was supposed to be isolated? That night, the noises outside felt different, heavier. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. I froze in bed, holding my breath, waiting for them to fade. They did, but I couldn't sleep after that. I kept my flashlight within reach and stared at the ceiling until morning. By the third day, I felt tense. The peace I had come for was gone. I decided to check the path near the treeline in daylight, thinking it might put my mind at ease. The trail led into the woods, winding through the trees for about 50 yards before opening into a small clearing. In the clearing were remnants of something I didn't want to find. There were makeshift wooden frames, like racks, built crudely out of branches tied together with rope. Hanging from one of them was a length of rope that looked freshly cut. On the ground was a pile of ashes from a fire, surrounded by more cans and trash. But what unsettled me most were the stains on the ground. Dark, irregular patches that looked like old blood. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding. It wasn't just kids messing around. The stains were too much for that, and the racks were too intentional. I couldn't explain it away anymore. Someone had been using that spot for something, and it hadn't been innocent. I backed out slowly, my eyes on the trees, half expecting someone to appear. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the doors and closed the curtains. For the rest of the day, I stayed inside, jumping at every noise. My plan had been to spend a week here, but I knew I wouldn't last. I decided I would leave in the morning. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something brushing against the cabin wall, a scraping, dragging sound. Then I heard the porch creak. Someone was out there. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I waited, counting the seconds, listening for anything. Then I heard it again, but this time at the back of the cabin. It was like whoever it was circled the cabin slowly, testing it. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but I had no service. I thought about running to the car, but the keys were hanging by the front door, and I'd have to cross the porch to get to it. So I stayed where I was, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon, and waited. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless half-sleep. When morning came, I didn't waste time. I packed quickly and loaded the car. I kept scanning the trees, half expecting someone to step out. Nothing moved, but the silence was heavier than ever. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as the dirt road allowed. As I drove, I noticed something I hadn't before. About a mile down the road, hidden behind a curve, there was another clearing. Parked in the clearing were 2 trucks, old and beat up, with coolers and tarps in the beds. No one was around, but the trucks looked like they hadn't been there long. It clicked in my head then. Whoever was using that trail by the cabin, whoever had been out there at night, they weren't just passing through. They were close. They had been there all along. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. When I finally got cell service, I pulled over and called the rental office. I told them I was cutting my stay short, made up some excuse about an emergency back home. I didn't mention the path, the stains, or the trucks. I didn't want to explain it, and I didn't want anyone to think I was imagining things. Back in the city, surrounded by noise and people, I tried to tell myself it was over, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about the footsteps on the porch, and the fact that someone had been circling that cabin in the dark while I lay inside, pretending to sleep. I knew I had left just in time. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have left at all. That cabin had been advertised as isolated, safe, and quiet, and it was. Too isolated, too quiet, the perfect place for people who didn't want to be found. People who were already using those woods long before I showed up. People who knew I was there. I had been driving for hours before I finally turned off the main road and onto the narrow dirt track that led to the cabin. The road was rough, full of rocks and shallow holes filled with rainwater, and each bump shook the old truck hard enough to rattle the gear stick in my hand. It was late afternoon, the kind of time when the sun hangs low but still gives off a steady brightness, and I could feel the day slowly fading as I climbed deeper into the woods. Tall pines closed in around me from both sides, and the shadows they threw across the track were long and sharp. I knew once I reached the cabin I wouldn't be hearing much of anything but wind moving through branches and maybe the sound of small animals. That was the reason I came out here in the first place. I wanted silence, space, and time to clear my head. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to an old family friend who didn't come out anymore. He had told me about it once, mentioned that it hadn't been used in years and was probably gathering dust. He gave me vague directions, and after a little digging around, I found it on a map. It was remote, tucked so far into the woods that no one ever stumbled across it by accident. The only way to find it was to know exactly where you were going, and even then it was easy to get lost. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun had dipped just low enough that the air was cooler. The cabin itself looked exactly like I expected. Small, made of logs that had gone gray with weather, a tin roof that was rusted in spots, and a porch that leaned slightly to one side as if the ground beneath it had shifted. The windows were dark, and I couldn't tell if the glass was still intact until I got closer. Grass and weeds had grown up high around the walls, and a few saplings were pushing in near the edges of the clearing. I parked the truck a few yards away, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment, listening. The silence was heavy, only broken by the ticking of the truck as it cooled and the faint rush of wind high in the trees. There wasn't another house for miles. No cell signal, no traffic, no voices, just the woods and me. I pulled my bag from the passenger seat, slung it over my shoulder, and walked up onto the porch. The steps groaned under my weight. The door was swollen from rain and hard to push open, but eventually it gave way, scraping against the floor. The inside smelled of old wood and dust, with a faint hint of mildew. The floorboards were warped in places, and cobwebs clung thickly to the corners. There was a small stone fireplace against one wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a cot pushed against the far corner with a mattress that looked thin and stained. I set my bag down and took a slow look around. Everything was quiet, but I had that strange feeling you get sometimes when you enter a place that hasn't been touched in years. Like the air itself has settled into a stillness that doesn't belong to you. I knew there wasn't anyone there, but I kept listening anyway, straining to catch any sound beyond the ones I was making. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, swept the dust from the cot, and set out the few supplies I brought. Canned food, a flashlight, a hatchet, a couple of knives, and a lantern. I had no plans for the night except to settle in and rest. By the time the sun dropped below the trees, the cabin was wrapped in darkness. I lit the lantern, ate a cold meal from a can, and stretched out on the cot. I could hear the woods alive outside, branches creaking, insects buzzing, and every so often the distant snap of something moving through undergrowth. It was the kind of noise that reminded me how alone I was. If something happened, no one would hear, no one would come. That thought stuck with me as I lay there. I closed my eyes and tried to push it aside, telling myself this was what I wanted. Solitude, a chance to be away from people, away from the constant weight of work, bills, and noise. Out here, I thought there was nothing to worry about but the basics: eating, sleeping, keeping warm. Simple. But sometime deep into the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what time it was, but the lantern had gone out and the cabin was pitch black. At first, I thought it was just the silence that woke me, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too complete. I lay still, trying to hear something, anything. Then I caught it, a faint crunch outside, footsteps, slow, careful, deliberate. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. The steps moved around the cabin, just outside the wall near the window. Then they stopped. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer, coyote, something moving through the clearing. But the weight of the sound didn't fit. It wasn't 4 legs rustling through leaves. It was 2 feet pressing down on dry grass. I stayed in the cot, eyes open to the dark, waiting. After what felt like forever, the sound started again, moving slowly along the side of the cabin, pausing, then moving again. My hands clenched tight. I thought about reaching for the hatchet I left on the table, but I was afraid that if I moved, whatever was outside would hear me. The steps circled halfway around, then stopped again. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I didn't know if the person, or whatever it was still standing there watching, or if they had gone back into the trees. I stayed awake like that for hours, not moving, barely breathing, until the faint light of dawn began to push through the cracks of the shutters. When it was light enough, I forced myself up and opened the door. The clearing looked the same as before, quiet, empty, with only the morning wind shifting the grass. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground, and that's when I saw them, footprints. Human footprints pressed deep into the soft dirt near the wall. They circled the cabin, stopping beneath each window, then continued off into the woods. I stood there staring at them, my stomach twisting. Whoever it was had come close enough to look inside. I had locked the door before sleeping, but the windows were thin and old. If they wanted to, they could have gotten in. For a long moment, I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving back down the rough dirt track. But part of me didn't want to be run off. I told myself maybe it was just some hunter passing through, curious about the old cabin. Maybe they didn't mean any harm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That whole day, I moved around with a tension I couldn't get rid of. I gathered wood, kept the hatchet close, and checked the treeline often. Nothing moved out there, but I could feel it, the weight of something unseen. When night came again, I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern lit and sat at the table with the hatchet in my hand, listening. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of wind. Then, sometime deep into the night, it started again. The crunch of footsteps, slow, careful, coming closer. I gripped the hatchet tighter, my mouth dry. The steps circled again, just like before, pausing at the windows, moving to the next. Then I heard it, the faintest creak of the porch steps. This time they were trying the door. The wood groaned under the weight of a hand pressing, testing. The latch rattled slightly. I sat there, frozen, every muscle tight, waiting for it to give. But it held. After a long moment, the sound stopped. I didn't hear footsteps leaving. Nothing. Just silence. I stayed there the rest of the night, staring at the door, waiting for it to move again. When daylight finally came, I opened it to find fresh footprints on the porch. That was enough. I packed my bag, threw it into the truck, and started down the dirt road without even finishing breakfast. Every bump and rattle of the drive felt like a relief, putting distance between me and that cabin. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and even then I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone following. I never went back. Whoever it was out there, they knew the cabin was used again. They knew someone was inside. And the way they circled, the way they tested the door, it wasn't curiosity. It was patience, waiting. And I didn't want to be the one who stayed long enough to find out what they were waiting for. I had been needing a break from everything for a while. My job had been running me down, and I thought a weekend away from the noise, away from the city, away from people, would be the thing I needed to clear my head. A coworker had once mentioned an old cabin out near the lake where he sometimes went hunting in the colder months. He told me it was quiet, no phone reception, no neighbors for miles, just forest, water, and silence. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove out on a Friday afternoon in late October. The sky was already heavy with low gray clouds, and the air had that damp bite to it that warned of winter getting close. The trees were losing their color, most of them already stripped bare, their branches thin and black against the sky. The road wound out further than I expected, turning from smooth asphalt into a single narrow lane of cracked pavement, then into gravel, and finally just a dirt path pressed down between the trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had already slipped low enough that shadows stretched long across the clearing. The cabin looked smaller than I thought it would. It was a single-room wooden place, built decades ago, weather-worn and leaning a little to one side but still standing firm. The roof was tin, spotted with rust, and there was a small porch with 2 steps leading up to the front door. To the right was a stack of firewood. Not much, but enough to get a fire going for the first night. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the truck was the quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, not peaceful. No cars, no distant hum of a town, not even birds. Just the sound of my boots crunching against the ground and the faint rustle of leaves blowing across the clearing. Inside, the cabin was simple. A wood stove sat against the left wall, with an iron pipe that climbed through the ceiling. There was a cot pushed up against the far wall, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves with dusty glass jars and rusted pans. A lantern hung from a nail, and next to it was a box of matches. It smelled of dust, wood smoke, and old fabric. I set my bag down on the cot and unpacked the basics I had brought. Clothes, some canned food, a flashlight, batteries, and a small hunting knife. I figured I would make a fire before it got too dark, so I went back out to the stack of wood and carried in a few logs. That first night was quiet, too quiet. I sat at the table after eating a can of beans, the lantern hissing faintly as it burned. The fire crackled in the stove, the heat slowly pushing back the damp chill that had settled inside. I tried to relax, but my ears kept catching at every sound. The creak of the wood, the soft ping of cooling metal, the faint wind against the door. It was the kind of silence that made every noise feel louder than it should. When I finally lay down on the cot, I stared at the dark ceiling for a long time before sleep came. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but when I held still and listened, I knew it was real. It was a scraping noise, faint, dragging, somewhere outside the cabin. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer brushing against something. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for it to stop. After a while, it did. The silence returned, heavy again. I stayed awake a long time after that, ears straining. At some point, I must have drifted back into sleep. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. The clearing was empty, quiet. The ground was damp from a light rain during the night, but nothing seemed disturbed. I walked around the cabin just to be sure, and that was when I saw them, marks in the dirt near the back wall. They looked like lines, uneven and broken, dragging through the mud. Too long and too deep for an animal's paw or hoof, almost like someone had taken a stick and pulled it through the soil. I stared at them longer than I needed to, my stomach sinking. There were no boot prints, no signs of someone walking, just those long dragging lines, starting from the edge of the trees and leading right up to the back of the cabin, and then stopping. I told myself it was nothing, probably branches blown down in the wind, scraping across the ground. The forest was full of fallen limbs this time of year. That was all it was. Still, I felt uneasy. I spent the day trying to distract myself, chopping some of the wood into smaller pieces, boiling water on the stove, walking down the narrow trail that led toward the lake. The path was soft and covered in wet leaves, the air thick with the smell of rot and damp earth. I didn't stay long by the water. The clouds were heavy again, and the wind picked up until it pushed ripples across the lake's dark surface. When I came back, I noticed something else. The back door, the one I hadn't used, looked slightly different. The frame had a fresh mark in it, a thin, pale scrape in the wood, just about eye level, like something hard had brushed against it. That night, I couldn't sleep easily. I kept listening for sounds outside. The fire burned low, and I lay staring at the dark, ears picking up every creak of the cabin, every groan of wood as it cooled. Then, just as I started to drift, I heard it again, the scraping. This time it was closer, slower, dragging against the side of the cabin. My chest tightened as I lay frozen, my eyes wide in the dark. It moved along the wall, pausing, then continuing. At one point, I thought I heard something tap against the wood. Not hard, just a light, deliberate tap. I gripped the hunting knife I had left on the crate next to the cot. My mind kept telling me it was an animal, it had to be an animal. But the sound was too controlled, too steady. After what felt like an hour, the noise stopped again. The silence that followed was worse. In the morning, I forced myself to check. My hands shook as I walked around the cabin. On the left side, in the damp wood, were more marks. Long, uneven, dragging lines running against the wall. Fresh, pale scratches in the old boards. Too high up to be from anything small. I felt sick. Someone had been out here during the night. That was the only thing that made sense now. Not an animal. Someone. I packed my bag that afternoon. My plan had been to stay until Sunday, but I couldn't stand the idea of another night. The air felt wrong, heavy with the kind of silence that presses against your skin. I loaded my things into the truck and turned the key. The engine coughed, then sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing but a weak grind. I checked the gauges. Everything was fine when I had arrived. The tank half full, the battery good. Now it was dead. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, but I knew nothing about fixing it. All I could do was see what was missing, and I saw it fast. The battery cables had been cut. Clean. Not frayed, not chewed by animals. Cut. That was when it sank in. Someone was doing this. I had been looking forward to spending a weekend at the small cabin for a long time. The cabin was old, built by my grandfather decades ago, and it sat deep in the woods, away from any neighbors, away from the road, away from everything. It was the kind of place you had to hike to, following a long dirt path that twisted through thick trees until the sound of the world behind you slowly faded away. The cabin itself wasn't much. It had one room, a small kitchen space with a wood stove, a narrow bed pushed up against the far wall, and a table with 2 chairs. The windows were small and square, just enough to let in some daylight but not wide enough to see far into the trees. There was no running water, no electricity, nothing modern at all. Just a roof, for walls, and the silence of the woods. I had been planning this trip because I wanted to be alone. I had been tired of the noise of the city, the stress of people everywhere, the constant rush of daily life. I thought a weekend alone in the cabin would clear my head. I packed light food, water, a lantern, a sleeping bag, a knife, some matches, and a flashlight with spare batteries. The hike to the cabin was tiring, but I enjoyed every minute of it. The air smelled cleaner the deeper I went. The sound of cars disappeared, and all I could hear was the wind in the trees and the occasional bird. By the time I reached the cabin, sweat was running down my back, but I felt good. I unlocked the door with the old key I kept on my keychain. The door creaked open, and the smell of old wood and dust drifted out. It was exactly how I remembered it from years ago. I set my bag down on the table and opened the windows to let some fresh air in. The sun was still high, so I decided to take a walk down to the stream about half a mile from the cabin. The stream was one of my favorite places. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth rocks, and the sound of it always made me feel calm. I spent about an hour at the stream, sitting on a large flat rock and watching the water move. I filled my bottle, splashed my face, and then walked back to the cabin before it got too late. By the time I returned, the shadows of the trees were long and the light was fading. I started a fire in the wood stove, heated a can of beans, and ate quietly at the table. The silence of the woods settled around me in a way that was both comforting and a little unsettling. That first night, I fell asleep quickly, listening to the crackle of the fire. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing embers. The cabin was dark except for the faint light of the moon through the small window. At first, I didn't know why I had woken up. Then I heard it. It was faint but clear enough. The sound of crunching leaves outside. Slow steps, one after another. I froze on the bed, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. At first, I thought it might just be a deer. There were plenty of animals in those woods, but the steps didn't sound like the quick, light movements of an animal. They sounded heavy, careful, almost cautious. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. The steps moved closer, circling the cabin. I could hear them on the leaves, then on the small patch of dirt near the door. They paused there, and I held my breath, waiting. The doorknob rattled, soft at first, then harder, like someone was testing it. I had locked the door. I was sure of it, but the sound made every muscle in my body tighten. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. The steps moved slowly around the cabin again, circling, crunching through the leaves. I was too scared to move. I just lay there in the bed, staring at the faint light of the window, listening until finally, after what felt like forever, the steps grew fainter. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours, not moving, hardly breathing, until finally exhaustion dragged me back into sleep. When I woke up in the morning, sunlight filled the cabin, and for a moment I thought maybe I had dreamed it. But when I went outside, I saw them. Clear footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Large, heavy footprints, boot prints. They circled the cabin, stopped at the door, then moved back into the trees. The sight of them made my stomach turn. Someone had been out there in the middle of the night, walking around the cabin, trying the door. I looked out into the woods, but of course, there was no one there. Just the endless trees, the sound of the wind. I told myself it was probably just a hunter, maybe someone lost, someone curious. I tried to push it out of my mind. I spent the day chopping some firewood, fishing at the stream, and walking the trails near the cabin. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about those steps, about the sound of them circling me while I lay in the bed, about the rattling of the doorknob. That night, I made sure the door was locked tight. I placed my knife on the table next to the bed and kept the flashlight within reach. I let the fire burn brighter than before, just to keep the cabin lit. But still, I found it hard to sleep. I lay there for hours, listening, waiting, every sound of the woods outside making me flinch. Around midnight, it happened again. The steps, slow, steady, crunching through the leaves. This time, I sat up, knife in my hand, heart racing so hard I thought it might explode. The steps came closer, circling the cabin just like before. Then silence. I held my breath. The silence was worse than the sound. At least when I heard the steps, I knew where whoever it was had gone. But when it went quiet, I felt blind. Minutes dragged by. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp sound hit the door. A scrape like metal on wood. I gripped the knife tighter. The sound scraped again, slower this time. Someone was trying something against the lock. My chest tightened. I thought about yelling, but what good would that do? There was no one around for miles. No one to hear me. I just sat there in the dark, gripping the knife, listening to the sound at the door. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The steps moved away again. I stayed awake until the sun rose, every nerve in my body on edge. When I finally dared to go outside, I saw more footprints, fresh ones in the dirt. I saw scratches on the door, small but deep, as if someone had used a blade or some kind of tool on it. My throat went dry as I traced them with my fingers. This wasn't random. This wasn't some lost hiker. Someone had come here in the middle of the night and tried to get inside. I thought about leaving right then, but the hike back to the road was long, and I wasn't sure if whoever it was might be watching from the woods. I felt trapped. I decided to wait until morning, pack up quickly, and leave then. I spent the whole day with my chest tight, nerves shaking, checking the trees, jumping at every sound. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat at the table, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, the fire burning bright. I told myself if they came again, I'd be ready. And they did. The steps came back, later this time, closer to 2 in the morning. Slow, steady, circling. I sat there, frozen, staring at the door. Then I heard it again. The scraping, sharper now, harder. The doorknob rattled. My heart hammered as I gripped the knife. The sound went on for minutes, scraping, rattling, testing. Then silence. I waited, holding my breath, the fire crackling in the silence. Suddenly, from the side window, a flash of movement, a shadow. I turned, flashlight beam cutting across the room, but the window showed only darkness outside. I stood up, my legs shaking, flashlight on the window. Then, from the other side of the cabin, a loud thud. I spun around, flashlight and knife ready. Another thud, heavier this time. Someone was testing the walls, the strength of the wood. I knew then that I couldn't wait until morning. Whoever this was, they weren't going to stop. They wanted inside. I stuffed my bag with the essentials: flashlight, knife, water, matches. I left everything else behind. I waited, listening to the sounds outside, waiting for a gap, for silence. Then, heart pounding, I blew out the fire, cracked the door open as quietly as I could, and slipped out into the night. The woods were black around me, the moonlight only faint through the thick trees. I moved quickly but quietly, every step on the leaves sounding like thunder in my ears. I didn't dare turn on the flashlight. I just followed the faint trail the way I had come. Behind me, in the distance, I heard it. Steps, heavy, following. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, faster, stumbling in the dark, my breath sharp in my throat. The trail seemed endless, the trees all the same, but I forced myself forward. Every crack of a branch behind me made me move faster. After what felt like hours, I finally saw it, the faint line of the road through the trees. I ran the last stretch, bursting out of the woods, stumbling onto the dirt road. My chest burned, my legs shook, but I didn't stop until I was halfway down the road, away from the tree line. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The whole idea was to get away from everything, to cut myself off from work, from the noise of the city, from the steady rhythm of traffic and phones and people always pushing by on sidewalks. I wanted silence, a place where I could think clearly and breathe without feeling like my lungs were stuffed with dust and fumes. When I finally found the cabin listing online, it seemed perfect. It was far up north, deep in a stretch of woods that bordered a lake. The photos showed a small wooden cabin with a porch, a single chimney, and a dirt path leading down to the water. No other houses, no paved roads, just trees, the lake, and the cabin itself. I packed light because I thought it would only be a week. I brought clothes, some food, a camping stove just in case the power didn't work, a small toolbox, a flashlight, and a single hunting knife that had been sitting in a drawer for years. I didn't expect to need it, but something about going into the woods made me want to have it near me. I left early in the morning, drove for hours, and when I finally got off the main highway onto smaller and smaller roads, I felt the quiet creeping in already. The last few miles were nothing but dirt trail, overgrown with weeds, with branches scraping the sides of my car. The cabin looked smaller in person than in the photos. The wood was darker, weathered by years of rain and snow. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch boards creaked when I stepped on them. The door was stiff when I pushed it open, like it hadn't been used in months. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of mildew. There was one small living space with a stone fireplace, a kitchen in the corner with a sink that connected to an old water pump, and a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom. Everything felt like it had been abandoned for a long time, and for a moment I wondered if the listing had been fake. But there was a working generator shed out back, a propane tank for the small stove, and a stack of split firewood leaning against the wall. The first day passed quietly. I set my things down, swept dust off the wooden floor, and opened the windows to let fresh air inside. The lake was only a short walk away, and I stood by the water for a while, watching the reflection of the trees ripple on the surface. The silence was heavier than I expected. No boats, no voices, no faint hum of distant roads. Just the buzz of insects and the occasional call of a bird. That night, the quiet turned heavier. The generator made a dull hum when I switched it on, and a single bulb lit the living room. I cooked a small meal, sat on the porch, and tried to enjoy the stillness. But as the sun dropped and the woods darkened, the silence stopped feeling peaceful. It felt like something was pressing against me from all sides. The air grew colder. Every creak of the cabin made me turn my head. By the time I went to bed, I felt restless and tense, like I was listening for something I couldn't hear. The second night was when I noticed the footprints. During the day, I had gone down to the lake again. I walked along the shore, looked at the line where the sand met the water, and noticed a set of prints that weren't mine. They were deep, pressed into the wet sand, leading from the woods down to the water's edge. They were boot prints, large ones, much bigger than my shoes. I stood there staring at them, my stomach tightening. They were fresh. The edges were sharp, not smoothed over by rain or wind. Someone else had been there, maybe only hours before me. I told myself it could have been an old hunter, or maybe a fisherman who passed through. But the cabin was supposed to be isolated. No roads came this far in except the one I drove, and I hadn't seen another car. The prints didn't make sense. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening for anything outside. The woods seemed too quiet, like the silence was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard something crunch in the distance. Leaves or twigs. Slow steps moving closer. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stayed still, every muscle tight, straining to hear. The steps stopped just beyond the cabin walls, near the porch. Then nothing. I wanted to get up and look, but I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. Hours passed before I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. Dirt was smeared on the boards, and I could make out a faint boot print near the edge. Someone had stood there during the night. I tried to calm myself by saying it might have been a hiker, someone who stumbled onto the cabin and looked around before leaving. But the prints didn't lead away. They ended at the porch. Whoever it was had stood there watching and then turned back the way they came. The third night, I locked the door and windows tight. I left the flashlight and knife by the bed. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a noise, a faint scraping against the side of the cabin. Slow, dragging, like someone running a stick or knife along the wall. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I sat up, gripping the knife, staring into the darkness. The scraping stopped, then shifted to the window. A dull tap, followed by silence. I held my breath, waiting. My skin prickled. After a long minute, the sound moved away into the woods. The following day, I searched around the cabin. In the dirt near the sidewall, I found more prints. Heavy boots again, circling the building. The hairs on my neck stood up. Whoever was out there wasn't passing through. They were watching me, The food I brought wouldn't last if I stayed the whole week, and I realized I didn't want to anymore. I thought about leaving early, but the dirt road back to the main highway was long and rough, and I didn't want to drive it in a rush at night. I decided to wait until morning. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the generator off, the lights out, holding the knife. The woods outside were black. Around midnight, I heard the porch creak. Slow, deliberate steps. My throat went dry. The door handle rattled once, softly. I gripped the knife tighter, my whole body shaking. Then, nothing. Minutes stretched into hours. The footsteps didn't return. At dawn, I packed my things fast. I didn't bother eating. I shoved everything into the car and started the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel. The road out was rougher than I remembered, branches clawing at the sides of the car, every bump making me flinch. When I finally hit pavement, I drove without stopping for hours. When I got home, I checked the cabin listing again. The page was gone, completely removed, like it had never been there. To this day, I don't know who was in those woods, or why they circled the cabin at night. But I know they were watching me, and I know if I had stayed one more night, I might not have left at all. I decided to spend a few weeks in a cabin that belonged to a distant relative. The place was tucked away deep in the woods, not far from a lake, but far enough that you had to hike a narrow dirt path to get to it. The cabin was old, built from dark wood that had aged with time, and though it was small, it had everything I thought I would need. It was supposed to be a quiet break from city noise, a time to be alone, to clear my head, and to just live with nothing but nature around me. When I arrived, the air smelled like pine and damp earth. The dirt road that led part of the way had ended about half a mile from the cabin, and I had to carry my things by hand the rest of the way. The silence was heavier than I expected. In the city, silence never felt complete. There were always distant car horns, people's voices, or the hum of machines. Out here, silence pressed down on me, broken only by the faint sound of wind moving through the trees or the occasional call of a bird. Inside, the cabin was as simple as I imagined. A single main room with a wood stove, a bed pushed against one wall, shelves stocked with a few old canned goods, a table and 2 chairs. In the corner was a small bathroom with just a toilet and sink, no shower. Water came from a pump outside. There was no power, no cell signal, and no road traffic anywhere near. I had brought along lanterns, batteries, food, and tools, making sure I had more than I thought I would ever need. The first day went as I hoped. I unpacked, set up my lanterns, and went to fetch water from the pump. The water was cold and metallic, but safe enough after I boiled it. I ate simple food, sat on the small porch, and watched the woods as the sun lowered. At night, the darkness felt thicker than anything I had ever known. Without streetlights, it was as if the world ended just beyond the trees. I could only hear the occasional snapping branch somewhere far off, probably animals moving through. I had told myself that was all part of the charm. The second day, I walked to the lake. It was larger than I expected, the water dark and calm, surrounded by trees that leaned toward it as if watching. The path was overgrown, but it wasn't hard to follow. I didn't swim, but I sat by the water and listened to insects buzzing in the warm air. That night, I felt a bit of unease. The sounds outside the cabin seemed sharper than the night before. I told myself I was adjusting, that I just wasn't used to how amplified every crack or rustle could sound when there was no background noise. By the third day, I noticed something odd. Near the tree line behind the cabin, a patch of ground looked disturbed, as though something heavy had been dragged through the leaves and dirt. I thought maybe a deer had wandered close and scraped at the ground. The mark led away from the cabin toward the thicker trees. It wasn't a clean path, but more like patches of flattened earth and scattered leaves, as if something or someone had dragged a weight. I crouched and studied it for a while, then told myself it was nothing. Maybe a fallen branch had been pulled along by wind or an animal. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. At one point, long after midnight, I heard a sound like footsteps outside on the porch. Slow, careful steps, My body tensed, every muscle locked. I held my breath. The sound stopped. After what felt like hours, I forced myself up, held my lantern toward the window, and peered out. Nothing was there, just trees and blackness. I went back to bed, though I never really fell asleep again. In the morning, I checked the porch. No footprints. The boards looked the same as before. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was letting my imagination play tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there. I decided to keep busy that day, chopping wood, cleaning the small cabin, and boiling extra water for storage. Keeping myself occupied kept my mind from drifting. But when evening came, the unease returned. I made a habit of checking the doors and windows more than once. The cabin had only one door with a simple lock, and the windows were old, with latches that could be lifted easily from the outside if someone tried hard enough. I pushed a chair against the door before lying down. I must have slept, because I woke with my heart pounding at a noise. This time it was the sound of something brushing against the outside wall. A slow scrape moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I froze in bed. The sound paused, then started again on a different wall. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling. When dawn came, the silence outside felt different. I stepped out onto the porch carefully, scanning the ground. Again, I saw disturbances in the leaves near the trees. This time they were closer, as if someone had moved toward the cabin and then back away. The prints weren't clear enough to tell if they were human or animal, but the ground was undeniably disturbed. I felt sick with the realization that I wasn't imagining it. That day, I considered leaving. The nearest small town was a couple of miles away, and I could have walked the road back to where I had left my car. But I kept convincing myself it was still just animals, maybe a bear or coyotes. I didn't want to seem foolish, even to myself, so I stayed. I wish I hadn't. That night was the worst yet. Around midnight, I heard the faint creak of the porch again. I stayed in bed, gripping the blanket, my body stiff with fear. The sound stopped, then came again, this time heavier, closer to the door. The chair I had placed against the door rattled slightly, as though something tested the handle. I stared at the dark outline of the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it didn't. Minutes passed. Hours. The sound finally faded. When daylight came, I opened the door and saw fresh marks on the wood near the handle. Small scratches, as if something metal had scraped there. That was no animal. My stomach dropped, and I felt the air rush out of me. Someone had tried to get inside. I spent that whole day in fear. I didn't leave the cabin. I kept checking the trees, certain I would see someone watching me. I tried to eat but couldn't. I thought of leaving again, but I also thought about whoever was out there waiting. If I stepped onto that trail alone, I would be exposed. The cabin at least had walls, thin as they were. That night, I barely moved. I sat at the table with my lantern off, staring at the door. At some point, I heard footsteps again. Slow, steady, deliberate. They circled the cabin. My mouth went dry. Then came the sound of breathing. Not mine, just outside the window nearest the bed. Heavy, steady breathing, as if someone stood there, inches from the thin glass, waiting. My skin crawled. I didn't move. The breathing eventually stopped, but I never slept. Morning brought no comfort. I checked again, and on the outside of the window, in the thin layer of dust on the wood frame, I saw a faint smear, like someone had pressed their hand there. A human hand, larger than mine. I couldn't deny it anymore. Someone was out there. Someone who had been circling the cabin, trying to get in. Watching, waiting. I knew I had to leave. I packed what I could carry and waited until midday, when the woods were bright. I stepped off the porch and started down the path toward where I had left the car. My eyes darted everywhere, scanning the trees, my ears straining for sounds. Every crack of a twig made me flinch. When I reached the spot where the dirt road began, I froze. My car was there, but the tires were slashed. All four of them. The windshield was cracked, and the doors were scratched with long marks. Someone had made sure I couldn't leave. Panic hit me so hard I had to grip the side of the car to steady myself. I looked down the road, long and empty, knowing it would take hours to walk to town. The woods pressed close on both sides. Anything could be watching me. I turned back, unable to make myself walk the road alone. I thought maybe if I stayed in the cabin during the day, I could last until I figured something else out. The walk back felt like a death march. Every step I expected something to leap from the trees. When I finally reached the cabin again, sweat ran down my back and my hands shook. I locked the door and pushed the chair against it again. I felt trapped, but it was all I had. That night was the breaking point. The footsteps came again, but this time they didn't stay outside. The door rattled harder than before, the chair scraping across the floor. My chest tightened so much I thought I would pass out. I gripped a kitchen knife I had taken from the shelf, my knuckles white. The rattling stopped. Silence stretched on and on. Then came the sound of glass breaking. The small window by the sink shattered inward. I ran to the far corner of the cabin, knife in hand, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't see who it was, but I heard boots on the floorboards. Slow, steady, moving inside now. My lantern was off, but moonlight through the broken window cast faint silver across the room. I held my breath, waiting. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would give me away. The footsteps came closer, stopping in the center of the room. Whoever it was stood there, silent, listening. I stayed as still as I drove up to the cabin because I wanted some quiet time away from the noise of the city. It had been a long stretch of work with barely any breaks, and I felt burned out. I thought a few days in a cabin, surrounded by trees and nothing else, would help me reset. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was old, built of dark wood, and stood at the end of a dirt road that twisted through miles of forest. I rented it online from someone who barely spoke to me when I picked up the keys. They gave me a warning about the road being rough and told me there was no phone service in the area. I didn't think much about it. I wanted silence anyway. The drive there was longer than I expected. The road turned into gravel, then narrowed until it felt more like a trail than something meant for cars. My tires crunched on rocks, and tree branches reached across the road, scraping against the side of my vehicle. I passed no other cars, no houses, no signs of life. Just endless trees pressing in closer the deeper I went. By the time I saw the cabin, I already felt a strange sense of isolation, like I had crossed into a place people rarely came. The cabin itself was small, maybe one main room with a kitchen corner, a single bedroom, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The smell inside was old wood mixed with damp air. The windows were small, and the forest outside pressed against them so closely that it felt like the trees were watching. I unpacked slowly, trying to get used to the silence. It was heavy silence, the kind that made every little sound stand out. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the tap of branches on the roof. First, I tried to enjoy it. I sat on the porch with a book and listened to the forest. The air was still, broken now and then by the call of a bird or the crack of something moving through the underbrush. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed how loud those small sounds became when there was nothing else. I kept glancing up from my book, expecting to see something, but the forest always looked empty. That first night was hard. The darkness in the forest was unlike anything I was used to. No streetlights, no distant glow of buildings, just total black pressing against the windows. Inside the cabin, every sound seemed sharper. I heard the wind move through the trees and branches snap outside, but it was impossible to tell how far away anything was. I kept waking up, listening, my heart pounding. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy creaks on the old wood. I held my breath and stared at the ceiling. When nothing else happened, I told myself it must have been the wood settling, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked the porch. The wood was damp from dew, but I saw no footprints. Still, the boards looked scuffed, like something heavy had pressed against them. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a deer brushing against it. I tried not to let it get to me. I went for a short walk instead, following the dirt road back the way I came. The forest was dense, with tall pines and oaks standing so close that little sunlight reached the ground. After just a short walk, I realized how easy it would be to get lost if I stepped off the road. The trees looked the same in every direction, and the air was still muffling distance. When I got back, I noticed the cabin looked different in the daylight. It felt less like a getaway and more like something abandoned, a place left behind and slowly being swallowed by the forest. The paint on the trim had long since peeled away. The roof sagged slightly. Around the sides of the cabin, weeds grew tall, and a section of the wall had rotted near the bottom. It didn't feel like somewhere people stayed often. That night, the sounds returned. This time, I was sure I heard movement. The creak of the porch boards, then silence, then another faint sound, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. My chest tightened as I lay in bed, straining my ears. Then I heard what sounded like a slow drag across the porch, like a boot scraping wood. I sat up, every hair on my body standing up. I wanted to look, but the idea of pulling back the curtain made my stomach twist. Instead, I sat frozen in the dark, listening. The sound stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, standing in the dark, listening back. In the morning, I forced myself to check. The porch boards were marked again, faint grooves that hadn't been there before. This time, I noticed something else. The cabin door frame had a fresh scratch in the wood, long and thin, as though something sharp had dragged across it. My stomach turned, but I told myself maybe it was a branch blown by the wind. I didn't fully believe that, but I clung to it anyway. The next 2 days, the feeling of being watched grew worse. I spent most of the day inside, checking the windows, peering out at the forest. Every time I thought I saw something between the trees, a shape too still to be natural, but when I stared longer it was gone. At night, I barely slept. The sounds on the porch continued. Sometimes it was the creak of weight shifting. Sometimes it was softer, like someone dragging a hand along the wood. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I would leave in the morning. The rest I came here for had turned into constant fear. That night, the noises were louder. I heard definite footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart hammered as I sat up in bed, clutching the flashlight I had brought. The steps moved along the porch, then paused near the door. The cabin was so silent I could hear my own breathing. Then came a faint rattling, as if someone tested the doorknob. I sat frozen, gripping the flashlight, too scared to move. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded. When the first gray light of morning came, I rushed to pack my things. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes into my bag. I stepped onto the porch, ready to leave, but then I froze. On the wood right outside the door were clear prints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. They were long, narrow, pressed deep into the damp wood. Whoever had been out there wasn't wearing anything on their feet, and the prints were fresh. They faced directly toward the door, as if whoever stood there had lingered for a long time. I didn't bother checking for anything else. I threw my bag in the car, turned the key, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could. The trees whipped by, and every shadow between them made me grip the wheel tighter. I didn't look back at the cabin. When I reached the main road, I finally pulled over, my hands trembling. My phone picked up service again, and messages poured in. But I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, staring at the forest stretching behind me. I realized how close I had come to something I couldn't explain, something human but not right. Whoever had been out there wanted inside. They had walked barefoot through the forest, crept onto the porch, and tested the door while I lay awake just feet away. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked for the deposit I left with the owner. The thought of stepping inside that place again made my chest tighten. I still think about those footprints sometimes, clear in my mind, pressed deep into the damp wood, facing the door as if waiting. And I know that if I had opened it, if I had looked out that night, I would have seen someone standing there in the dark, watching me.